episode 2 of the KVF Off the Cuff podcast, where our topic will cover the concept of de-escalation in law enforcement. Now, a bit of housekeeping, we made a slight tweak to the name of the podcast to make it easier to find. So if you're searching or telling someone else about our channel, just preface the off the cuff with the letters KVF, which will get you right to our content. Now, the term de-escalation can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. During today's discussion, we'll hopefully be able to build and add clarity to what it is, what it isn't, unreasonable or false expectations surrounding de-escalation, as well as talking about some of the myths folks might have. I'm one of your co-hosts, Ken. To my right are our other two co-hosts, Victor and Frank. We are 3 retired Phoenix police officers with 80 years of combined law enforcement experience. And on today's episode, we're extremely delighted to have with us Nicole Florisi to my immediate right here as our special guest. Nicole, thanks so much for being willing to carve out some time out of your very busy schedule. I know you do a lot of traveling, so it's not always easy to set time aside to do stuff like this. But we think this is a very important topic, and thanks also for being willing to make the trip up to the beautiful White Mountains of northern Arizona to sit with us today. That means a lot to us as a panel. Before we dive in, and for the sake of our viewers, let me go over your background, which is quite extensive. And to make sure I don't make a mistake, I wrote it out.
How do you feel when people kind of bring up your background and talk about it?
You know, it's cool.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, hey, I think it might set people up for false expectations. They're going to think I'm really awesome, and hopefully I live up to that, you know, but let's roll.
Yep.
Yeah. So Nicole's the Director of Content and Curriculum at Force Science, whose mission is to provide high-quality research and training in order to advance expert decision-making, superior performance, and honest accountability in public safety. I'm going to break in, go down a little bunny trail. For any of you watching or listening, and especially if you're law enforcement, if you have never, ever had a chance to take any Force Science training, look into it. I've taken several of their courses. I know Frank has taken some, and without a doubt, I think it is some of the best training that you will ever have for your career survival. Getting back to Nicole's background, Nicole's passion is brain fitness and first responder wellness. She's created curriculum for and instructs in realistic de-escalation and force encounters investigations, and is a subject matter expert in de-escalation. She has extensive experience as an educator, police officer, and therapist. She provides frontline instruction in de-escalation, crisis communications, and force encounters investigations. With over 25 years of experience, she's held positions including communications specialist, patrol officer, patrol sergeant, investigator, and acting chief. She has held previous roles as law enforcement subject matter expert at VirTra, which is VirTra Simulation Systems, and as the executive director for the Verde Valley Sanctuary, a shelter dedicated to providing services for victims of sex trafficking, sexual violence, and domestic violence. She holds 2 postmaster's degrees, one in human factor psychology and one in trauma counseling, a Master of Science in professional counseling, and a Bachelor of Science in public safety administration and emergency management. Nicole's currently working on her doctorate in clinical psychology. Man, that's a lot. So did I miss anything?
What do you do on your free time?
I'm a gamer. Just remember that. I'm a gamer, people.
Yeah.
Got to have some way to decompress.
Yeah, we've had many conversations about gaming. So again, thanks for being with us. Means a lot. Let's just jump into kind of the discussion here. This is kind of a free-form discussion. And again, our goal is to try to, we're not necessarily making a podcast for cops, even though we know other cops might watch this, but try to educate the public a little bit on the topics we're discussing. So first of all, in your opinion, how is de-escalation defined? And before you answer that, a part A to that would be, is there any agreed upon national definition? We talk about organizations like PERF, PORAC, NAPO, the DOJ, stuff like that. So what would you say to that?
I would say definitely not. There's some commonality in definitions, but there's really no one agreed upon definition. Everybody seems to have their own.
If you're going to simple it up for the layman, what would be a simple way of describing de-escalation?
Well, that's actually kind of the nuance. I don't think it's very simple.
Okay.
One thing we can all agree on is Well, this is the part I think people forget when it comes to law enforcement. Like, we have a public safety and legitimate government interest.
Right.
Like, we are in a paid position as our job compared to perhaps other people's views of what that is. But of course, one of the goals is, can we lower emotional intensity, right? Can we allow the person that amount of time? Potentially hand in hand with that, are we able to potentially reduce the use of force? I mean, that's a big maybe, because
Right.
that really depends on the other person, not us, right? So you're going to see some commonalities in the definition. Lowering of emotional intensity, can we build some connection and relationship with that person, maybe to reduce or not have to use force? But what I think gets kind of forgotten, even though it seems simplistic, is we have to remember there's a legitimate public safety and government interest tied to de-escalation. And what's also forgotten, not necessarily in the definition, but it is tied to the other person's behavior, right? It's
Absolutely.
bidirectional. Like,
Yeah.
we have to work with somebody, and they have to be able to or willing to participate in that process with us. You know, it always
Yeah,
takes
one
two.
of the things I've always heard is the other guy always has a say, a vote in how things turn out.
Right.
Usually, yeah, usually. So tied in with that, let's talk about history of de-escalation. If you know, when do you think the term came into the common use in the law enforcement vernacular?
It actually started a little earlier, outside of law enforcement, really in inpatient psychiatry. If we look at, because they were looking at how can we actually reduce force in inpatient psychiatry? Is there something else we can do? So, like, we're talking like probably in 1950s, they were kind of looking at that, you know, and so that was looked at under a de-escalation umbrella. And then law enforcement, of course, there was a lot of what people consider like to their model. Okay, I'm not qualifying it, but an outside looking, there was too much force. Like, this is excessive. Like, why are people getting their butt kicked all the time? What does that look like? And so with that overarching umbrella, right, wrong, or indifferent, like the 70s started looking at, are we able to talk to people differently? What does that look like, right? And then through that development, like, are we able to build relationships? And then, you know, verbal judo comes into play. Doc Thompson's work, which I think is absolutely fantastic. I'm a big fan of verbal judo. You know, he looked at, in some ways, not that it wasn't like looked at through a research lens, but anecdotally, what's working with these cops that are out in the field? Like, what actually works? What are they saying that works? What are they saying that isn't working? So, you know, you look at that. And then, of course, any take blame out of it for a second, but any high profile incident to a degree, when there is a use of force, the conversation of de-escalation always comes up. Like, should we have put it in there? Like, what does that look like? But, you know, CIT programs, and what was that like? Was it 88? The Memphis model came out, you know, so it was looked at like, is that, you know, like, what does that look like? And so the interjection of de-escalation as a coined term, you know, I think has been kind of threading throughout. But I would submit to everybody, de-escalation has always been part of what we do and part of the conversation, regardless of what we've called it, either building relationships or whatever that looks like. And I would submit we're more successful, if you want to coin that term, more successful than people would really imagine. And we've been doing it regardless of what we've called it.
And so for citizens that might be watching us that don't live in the cop world, what is CIT?
Crisis intervention.
Training.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of departments started ramping those programs up to help with, I think, dealing with emotionally disturbed persons.
Yeah, it's really a worldwide program where the what they're trying to do worldwide is make it to where every police department has at least 30% of their staff trained in helping de-escalate people that have mental health issues, right? Somebody that may have a serious mental illness, right? Because you can only say drop the knife for so many times, right? You got to then have some kind of conversation with someone. So it's, you know, getting off of that repeat conversation and dialing it back and going, okay, that's not working. What can I do? How is this person responding? What does that look like? Can I change my positioning and things like that?
Yeah, and our program at Force Science, we work complementary with some of the CIT.
Right.
But we also have a little bit of a different philosophy, and we can talk about that later,
Yeah.
you know, kind of what that looks like. But yeah, so de-escalation has just kind of evolved over time. But again, one of the commonalities is really there's, and I say imagine to a degree because another person has participation in this, but are we able to lower emotional volatility or intensity as part of that? Can we allow for that to happen?
Right.
And I would submit to you, in the police world, that's the challenge. Can we? Maybe, but also maybe not. Like, what is that person doing, right?
Correct.
Like, where's the conversation about I think there's always I call it the shoulda, woulda, coulda, which doesn't really belong anywhere as far as I'm concerned. Well, you shoulda, woulda, coulda done something different.
Right.
If you shoulda, woulda, coulda said something else. If you
It's coupled with 20/20 vision of
hindsight, right?
Which we're not supposed to do.
I know,
or Monday morning quarterbacking.
Right. Or, holding people to a standard of an imagined outcome they wanted, and then they hold the officer against that imagined outcome. That's very challenging too.
Right.
But, we just need to be able, I do de-escalation I didn't mean to hit my mic, sorry. I do de-escalation, quote unquote, for therapists too. Like I train therapists and psychologists, like that civilian world.
Right.
One of the big, to your point about a definition, one of the points of, if you want to call it tension, is what about tools in de-escalation? The second you go hands-on, what about if a firearm or a taser is used? The civilian aspect of things, different role.
Yeah.
Our world, one of the big tension points is, say I'm dealing with somebody who is suicidal, right? They have a knife. Well, let's take firearms out of the conversation. I'm dealing with somebody who is armed with an edge weapon.
Right.
I beanbag them. Like I use a beanbag, and I am able to intervene. They drop the knife, lay with them the help they need. The tension point is that de-escalation or not?
Right.
And we could just sit here, 10 people, and some may go, absolutely, that situation is now de-escalated. Like we've been able to intervene, we've got that person help. Hey, great. And some people, even in the law enforcement world, will go, well, no, the tool is used, that doesn't meet de-escalation. Hence part of the challenge of there's no agreed upon definition. If a taser is used as de-escalation, if pepper spray is used, does it count as de-escalation? Oh my God, you shot and killed somebody? Well, if it's an active threat, active killer at a school, and we take out the threat and we have de-escalated them from continuing any farther and taking any more, is it de-escalation?
Absolutely.
And so that's the question. Because right now, there is no answer. Because there's no agreed upon definition of what that looks like.
Well, and I think you could put 10 police administrators in a room and give them all a piece of paper and say, I want all of you in about 2 lines to write out a definition of de-escalation. What would you get?
Right.
It would be a soup sandwich. It would be 10 different viewpoints, and none of them would totally agree on what it is. So it's this kind of unicorn that we're trying to implement into police work, I think. I think a lot of people, we look at de-escalation and they think it's tied to significant events in policing. So I go back to Rodney King. I go back to Ferguson. So we take these real high-profile use of force events, and then, of course, de-escalation gets coupled into the narrative. But very interesting I didn't know this, going back to the 50s in psychology and psychiatry and maybe mental hospitals and stuff like that.
Yeah, because there's high use of, if you want to qualify use of force, inpatient psychiatry, like the emergency room, have what's considered use of force, different than police, right? Because we obviously are always going to have like some type of lethal, right? But they have soft restraints, hard restraints, chemical restraints. Like they can physically restrain somebody. And back then, of course, we had a little bit more of what would be like an asylum-heavy society, right? Mental institutions. And so there's a lot of people, there's some people who aren't as violent, but there's violent people in there, right?
Right.
But they were doing a lot of this like restraint stuff, and they're like, is there something else we can do? Are there ways to build connections? So that's what we really started looking at. Are we able to build relationships? And that's part of it. Can I talk to somebody? Is there any connection I can build? But again, they have a different role than I would have as a police officer. They're under different constraints, right? So there's that. But there's a study, and you're going to forgive me, I can't remember where it was, but in the medical field, the use of force percentages are like 3.8 to 51%. Like nowhere in the history of law enforcement are we hitting like 50% use of force, like in any way, shape, or form. Like, I don't care how you take the numbers, right? But that's acceptable. Why? Because they're dealing with violence. They're dealing in the emergency room. Like when you have some type of, but it doesn't even have to be a mental health emergency. It could be a physical health emergency that causes non-compliance, right? What's Graham v. Connor built on? What's the event? A diabetic.
Yeah.
Like a non-compliant diabetic. It's a physical health emergency with a non-compliant subject. And then you think of how many of those exist. What other types of physical health can turn non-compliant? But like, for example, I saw a definition in one department about de-escalation, and this is the qualification. It's basically solely to build relationships with somebody with mental illness. And I'm not bashing on that department.
Does that mean you take them to coffee?
Right. Like, yeah, what does de-escalation do with that? But why only somebody mentally ill? One, that's very myopic.
It is.
Like can somebody without a mental illness go into a crisis? Of course. Like everybody in here has done a grief notification, and you deliver a message to a person that somebody that they love has passed away. And you need
Right.
to allow for de-escalation. Like if we've taken a pedestrian accident, right? If a 3-year-old gets hit in a crosswalk and you have 10 witnesses, you have 10 opportunities for what you would consider de-escalation, right? Because they're going to be very elevated based on what they saw. Domestic violence, a bar fight,
Right.
And could it be part of mental illness? Are some diagnoses more susceptible to a little bit more crisis or, inability to regulate?
Mm-hmm.
Sure, but you can have emotional dysregulation without a mental illness,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
So I think the focus, again, because there's these high-profile events sometimes where people don't like the outcome, especially if it's a force-related outcome, where it turned into like we as police officers, we don't de-escalate, or we hurt people with mental illness, or we kill people with mental illness, instead of the bigger question simply being, what was the behavior that created the use of force? We don't kill diagnoses. As much as everybody wants to put that label on us, we do not shoot and kill diagnoses. We may have to engage in a use of force event with somebody that has a diagnosis. Sure. But what's the behavior that created it? And
Right.
that's what's missing from the context of conversation. And especially with your guys' podcast, like educating the public, you could take so many headlines. And what do? They're, my husband, I like this line, he always uses it, if it bleeds, it leads.
Correct.
Right? And so
Correct.
what is missing typically from headlines is context for the use of force. And so people are left with what? Feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Police shoot and kill unarmed person. Police shot and kill a mentally ill individual. Police shot and killed somebody with autism. Police shot and killed somebody with schizophrenia. Police shot and killed somebody carrying knives. Like, okay, we don't shoot and kill people carrying knives. We don't shoot and kill people carrying guns. What's missing? But if that's all they know and they seek no further,
Right.
yeah, it's no kidding there's a disconnect.
Yeah.
It's just no kidding. Like, because they think that we're really, their perspective is very different than the reality of what we do. And so that can be kind of frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Well, you touched on the word verbal judo, and I remember I went through the academy in '89, and we had that block of training on verbal judo, and I had this picture in my mind. We're going to verbally jujitsu somebody, and then the example they use that I remember is like how to sell somebody on a negative experience, like giving them a traffic ticket.
Right.
Got to sell that ticket. Verbal judo, and that was kind of like a real. What's the word I'm looking for? It was just a real rough form of de-escalation before anybody had really coined the phrase in law enforcement, or it was widespread use of that phrase. But Frank, you have something?
Yeah, so we all know there can be positive outcomes when you use de-escalation techniques, but are there any downsides to those same tactics?
Well, sure. I think this is challenging to measure, but work with me for a second, right? How do we know if somebody's getting hurt when they're talking and they should be doing? Where's that conversation? Like the time for talking is past, or truthfully, the time for talking never existed. That person from the get-go wasn't able to participate in what I call this imaginary de-escalation process, right? Because de-escalation is a lot more nuanced than I think we give it credit, right? Because de-escalation encompasses so much. It's different communication styles, it's persuasion. We talk about the messaging we give to people, right? But it's hard to measure negativity, right? Because when the outcome is quote unquote what everybody wanted, because it worked out without a use of force, and that officer did and here's the challenge, think about this. We evaluate, let's say we're looking at the verbal interaction between the officer and the subject they're dealing with. Mm-hmm. And it's a textbook perfect de-escalation. Let's just talk, like the officer did everything and more than everybody. And there's no one who can look at the verbal interaction and go, man, they should have done something else. Like everybody agrees. Let's just for this moment, right?
Right.
And let's say it wasn't your positive outcome for a second. The person they're dealing with decided not to participate or couldn't. And then the officer gets in trouble, right? There's that one, right? They get judged on the outcome instead of the application of what they were doing. But the flip side to your point, there's also what we consider quote unquote positive outcomes that people like without use of force. And maybe that communication that the officer did, not to be judgy, right? But we could look at it and go, hey, perhaps there would have been something different. Maybe we want to encourage different tools. We'd like to help that officer, evaluate that situation differently. That's the hard part, because if it's always tied to the outcome, it's very challenging. And plenty of officers, I can say anecdotally, because there is a way to measure it, but we got to get to that point, have a story about where they were talking and they knew the time for talking was done. Or the narrative, what I call forced de-escalation, is interfering with their ability to apply whatever tactical decision they've chosen, right? And in some places you can see it play out. So that's the really challenging part of that, right? Because the outcome is what it is, and if it's because it rectified, again, without a use of force or whatever that is, it doesn't mean there's not potential hurdles along the way or things we need to consider, discuss, and have conversations about, because it's just not quite that simple. But every officer I know has a story about, hey, like, whether it's them or somebody they know, like they were talking when they should be doing, because the time was for doing. It was time to do an intervention. And that you shall de-escalate. Like what is it? Like, even when necessary, like all these fluffy words, right? But what does that mean? That's the hard part.
Right, and it's you hear, well, they should have de-escalated.
Yeah, I have a firm belief, I can only speak for myself in this, but if shoulda, woulda, coulda is part of the conversation, whoever said that doesn't belong in the conversation.
Right.
Like, because, outcomes are infinite. If we judge an officer for the infinite outcomes that didn't happen, that has nothing to do with something at Force Science we call honest accountability, right? Can an officer, look at what, like, basically think of this from a legal perspective, can they assess the lawfulness of their conduct, right?
Right.
Well, you can't be judged against infinite outcomes. Like, no officer, not anyone, can be judged against infinite outcomes that shoulda, coulda, woulda happened. All of us in hindsight, anybody can go, if you just would have said this, the outcome would have been different. Well, you don't actually know it's true. That's what you want to be true. That doesn't make it objectively true, right?
Right.
So, that's the challenge too. But, we judge officers against, not we at Force Science, we don't do that, but many people, judge officers on imaginary outcomes, what they wish would have happened, how they imagine it could have gone differently. Sure, there's times I look at stuff and I go, man, I wish they could have, but wish in one hand, people, you know what I mean?
Right.
The end result is it belongs to them in that moment, their perspective, like, how the inferences they made in that moment. So it's just really, it's really challenging.
Yeah, and I think especially, even amongst management and supervisors, well, if you would have done this, I would have zigged that instead of zagged. But
here's the
again,
thing,
what was the
maybe.
outcome?
That's the thing, maybe.
Exactly.
They're imagining going, hey, yeah, absolutely, if this would have been done, the outcome would have been different. Nobody actually knows the answer to that. Maybe the outcome could have been more catastrophic than what they wanted in the first place. We don't know. But the officer deserves to be evaluated in that moment under their perspective and, what they did against, the reasonableness. Not because we wish something would have happened differently, That's why when we evaluate use of force, like, it has that reasonableness, like, was it justified under the law? Was it reasonable? Was their threat assessment reasonable? All things considered. And in some areas, people are lacking in that for the officers, and that's not cool.
Right. So speaking of
lightly.
speaking of hindsight and law, so we're talking basically Graham v. Connor, and it talks about reasonable officer standard and evaluating force based on the totality of circumstances without the benefit of 20/20 hindsight.
Right.
Now, what we're seeing now is some police departments are trying to hold officers to standards that go beyond Graham v. Connor. And what kind of risks or downsides to those types of policies or that way of thinking are we seeing?
Well, to be honest, like, we know what we're seeing nationally. We're seeing it play out in front of us. Because I would submit to you, and this is just my perspective, I'm not an attorney, right? But, like, take the legal standard, even though that's super important, but take that out. It's creating a human performance issue. Really, because what is it tied to versus, hey, is it reasonable? Is your threat assessment reasonable? Like, what did you perceive in that moment? Like, even if looked at differently, right? Even looked at differently later, it didn't make it unreasonable. And that's the challenge, right? But when you put in, I call them the fluffy words, because I'm not an attorney, but the fluffy words that change the standard, it doesn't benefit anyone. And officers are getting hosed all over the country because of that, because they're held to standards they can't meet. It's that human that honest accountability, right? That human performance. Because
Right.
What I think we don't talk about is human performance limitations, and that qualifies under the law too. Like, there's human performance and human performance limitations. And when we hold officers to unmeetable standards, like a metric they cannot meet, or somebody imagines they should have, right? That's the challenge.
Right.
And that plays out all over the country, and we see that when the wording doesn't meet the reasonable standard.
Right.
And they've added, my husband and I, when we like teach citizens academies, for example, and we talk about use of force, we kind of use this one particular example, and like we put a box down, right? And we say to somebody, you have to pick up that box, but hold on a second. Just hold on 1 second. If you pick up that box with anything more than the minimum amount of force necessary, you're going to prison. Well, what's in the box? You don't get to know that. Well, how heavy is the box? You don't get to know that either, right? You don't get to know anything, but
Just like every
pick up the
situation you
box.
roll up on.
Because it's something tangible where you start to see things change, right? Like sports, like who hasn't played sports, right? Like even in a civilian class, who's played football? Who's played football in their life? I don't care if, from high school on. And you say, how do you tackle somebody? Do you tackle them with the minimum amount of force necessary? Or what do most people say? No, you tackle them to like knock them on their ass, man. Like you're trying to take care of business.
Right.
Nothing to do with use of force in reality police, but it's its own use of force in the sports world, right? But it's not with the minimum amount of force necessary. Like what is that? How can you know what that is? Like how is, you do 7 punches and the 8th one is bad, but if the 7th punch didn't work, you need the 8th. Like how do you know that? And those are the nuances of the conversation. And so officers get held to a standard, to be honest, they can't meet it. It's outside the human performance window. It's not something called honest accountability. You're probably going to hear me mention that quite a few times in this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Simply because we're talking about almost both sides of it, right? Like, can they predict the lawfulness of their encounter and use of force? But from the performance side of things, does it meet human performance and human performance limitations? Are we asking them to do something that no human being could do? Are we asking them to meet a metric that nobody could meet? And some of those, again, I call them the fluffy words, some of those fluffy words put it in a perspective where nobody could meet that. You can't know those things. It holds them to a standard they can't meet, and then they're in prison for meeting some imaginary standard. And we see that all over the country in different types of calls, different types of use of force events.
I think this next question is actually really relevant to this. Is there a way really to quantify or measure how much escalation is appropriate or needed prior to use of deadly force? Because you were just kind of talking about all of this, right?
I don't think so. It doesn't mean we can't develop in some way a research
Yeah.
project, but like in the crux of it, how do we evaluate it? In hindsight. I mean, I heard somebody say this, I would say, of course, it's true. Like we evaluate all use of force in hindsight. It already happened, right? But what we're supposed to remove is the bias of it, like, the hindsight bias or the Monday morning quarterback and stuff like that. But that's the question. How do you measure one successful de-escalation? How do you measure if something else would have worked? How can you hold somebody accountable to an imaginary outcome? Like for example, if you look at use of force in general, right? Say somebody goes to, and I'm not saying any company, a department chooses a de-escalation training. I think ours if they're smart, but let's just say like whatever de-escalation training is out there. And within 2 years of deployment, all their officers are trained and they measure use of force. And they're like, oh my God, we have reductions in force. De-escalation works. Does it? Does it? Maybe.
Maybe,
But that's
maybe
a
not.
right? Because what are the other variables we can't account for?
Yeah, it's very subjective.
What if across the country, if you look at reductions in proactive policing, right? Reductions in proactive policing would have a conversation with probably reductions in force, right? But now you've gone to de-escalation training. So is your reduction in force because you are not proactive? Is it because of the de-escalation? I mean, nobody's having that conversation. There's so many variables. Or I'll just use me. Let's say I've dealt with the same person 20 times. And I have been able to allow for de-escalation to happen with that person. But time 21, nope. But it's my fault if it didn't work? Like it's on me and not them? You know, I mean, that's
right.
part of it too. The failure of de-escalation is tied, like it's the onus on the officer. The failure of de-escalation becomes the officer's fault, stripping the person we're dealing with of all their agency. When I would submit to you guys, a lot of messaging in law enforcement is the agency that belongs to another person. Like a person has agency in this process, even with us in law enforcement, right? When it comes to de-escalation, we strip them of their agency because the onus always goes to the officer and never to what about the suspect's behavior, right? So it's not simple. There's so many variables. I'm not saying it couldn't be, and a lot of great minds, to be honest, way smarter than me, couldn't sit down and come up with a research project to look at the different variables to figure out what that looks like. But let's imagine it's after something like George Floyd. It's after a high-profile incident. Would you not imagine a whole bunch of officers are going, I'm not laying hands on anybody?
Well, of course, the
So-
Ferguson
Right,
effect.
absolutely.
Yep.
So like when you like put your hands up and go, like, I'm touching no one, right? So if you've done a de-escalation program at some point or you're continuing training, could not somebody come in and say, absolutely, like, hey, this is great, like reduction in force, de-escalation. It doesn't mean there's no relationship to the potential of better communication, persuasion skills, de-escalation skills, evaluating that profile and going, hey, I think I know what's best to connect with this person, or if I can connect. I mean, that exists, right? But it's, again, it's really pretty nuanced, I would submit.
Right, and plus, there's that saying, we've all heard it, is that we are only 50% of the equation, but yet when things go sideways, we're expected to take 100% accountability for
Right.
it. And that goes right into exactly what you're saying, we're only half of what's going on.
Right.
And if that other person doesn't cooperate as much as we're trying, it's going to come back on us regardless.
Yeah, you kind of hit, I think, the nail on the head of the one thing I think we spend the least time on in law enforcement. The person who, no matter what, chooses not to participate. Like, it's a choice.
They have a vote.
They absolutely, like, and there's nothing, not the best communicator on this earth, like, that has, like, I mean, every police award of amazing communication, right? Bring them there, the best communicator. And that person can say no. Or, like, there's a lot of stuff going on, like paid protesters. What if my goal when I go somewhere, my sole goal is to get arrested, and when I get arrested, to make sure I am everybody's best photo opportunity of how the police are treating me? Yeah, de-escalate that. Like, what does that mean? Like, because people have what I consider like I call it the traditional de-escalation umbrella, or certain like crisis type of events. Like, we're trying to build relationships under emotional intensity and heightened emotion. But de-escalation and persuasion and communication and stuff like that are far greater than this, what I would consider like this myopic traditional de-escalation interest. Because what about that? Or what about the person that's like lights on, nobody's home? They cannot participate. You can talk now and you can talk for the next 2 years, but it's a mental health or medical emergency or something else is going on and they cannot participate. Be it somebody imagines you're supposed to connect. Like, it doesn't work like that. We work mostly in the middle, and I would submit to you, we do a damn good job.
Yeah.
We talk more people in handcuffs than we ever fight in handcuffs. Yeah. Right. I always joke with everybody, like, missed opportunities in law enforcement to go into sales after you retire. Because if you can talk somebody in handcuffs, don't tell me you can't talk somebody in anything, right?
Yeah, right.
But, we talk most people in handcuffs, and the people we couldn't talk in handcuffs and that fight, we probably couldn't have talked in anyway. Like, a person has, like, they have choice in the matter. They can fight. Or even if they're scared, like, something interferes with that, right? So, I think we need to just help the public understand it's not as simple as it seems.
Yeah.
And just because even somebody goes to a training class and practices, let's say they have the best training program on this earth, they're actually allowing their officers to practice. Oh, I practice active listening. I've learned suicide intervention techniques. Like, I've learned how to deal with people who are actually super logical, like, at the moment, how to help reason with them. And they do all those things. They practice those skills, right? And still the person doesn't play.
Well,
Oh, my fault, right?
I've used the analogy before talking about this where a bunch of guys around the coffee table on a Sunday watching a football game, having the beer and pizza, and the field goal kicker misses what's basically a chip shot. And everybody's, oh my God, I could have made that field goal. No, you couldn't, or you would have been playing special teams in the NFL.
Right.
That's why
Right.
you're sitting here drinking beer and eating pizza.
Right, right.
Yep.
But and we see the same thing in police work in the public when they watch body camera videos and they have the God's eye perspective. They don't have tunnel vision. They don't have auditory exclusion. Their blood pressure's not through the roof. They get to watch it from an air-conditioned conference room 5 times if they want and slow it down and go,
Right.
Well, how could this have happened?
Or frame by frame analysis use of force, which just drives me insane, right? Because
Right.
that doesn't even meet, the Graham standard. Like,
Right.
oh, like, this shot was good, this shot was good, this shot was good. Oh, this one wasn't. You know what I mean? Like, no consideration for decision making under stress. And then, the public doesn't have the luxury of even getting this information unless maybe they're like an audio-visual person, like they really enjoy that stuff and they understand like the limitations of video. Because some people, remember when video came out, everybody thought like, it's kind of like I call it, like, remember when the taser came out, it was the answer to all the problems. Then video comes out and it's also the answer to all the problems because now we know exactly what happens. Like, no, you don't. Like, no, you don't. And then when you think about the bigger picture, departments releasing videos in the lens of transparency. That's what I'm trying to be transparent with my community, to give them the information, to show I'm not hiding anything. But whereas a discussion that no video that's released is actually fit for forensic analysis, it's not. There's no video, that video is not interrogated, right?
Right.
And then we question officers about something they experienced as if they're a witness.
Yes.
Their perspective drives use of force. That's what it is. Not me sitting here seeing what I see in detailed clarity in the entire video. Stuff like that. There's no conversation about the limitations of what that is.
Yeah, Nicole, this is all real interesting because we're talking about de-escalation, and there's not a real good de-escalation definition worldwide in a bunch of agencies. Ken said at the very beginning, there's 10 people in a room. They're all administrators. They're going to give you 10 different answers, right? And I haven't heard that there's agencies that are really doing an excellent job on actually defining this and then telling you 1 through 10 exactly what you should be doing. And it brings me to this question. Can you think of any examples of any poorly written policy language or de-escalation from police departments that maybe add risk or danger to police officers?
Well, I am not a policy evaluator. I just want to set that straight. But even the one I gave you where it's de-escalation is only for the mentally ill, right? And this is something very simple. But I think about policy related to decision making. So for example, let's imagine there's a policy about de-escalation. Even say the definition of what de-escalation, we're all hey, that's great. We're lowering emotional intensity. We're doing all these things. We want to build these relationships. And let's say the de-escalation definition sets some realistic standards. But I call it the imaginary checklist, but you should do this and this and this and this and this and this and this. And if you do all 10 of these things, let's just pick 10 because there's models out there. It's do 30 under stress, do 10 under stress. What does that even mean? How do we know these 10 are going to work? Are not individuals human beings and who they are on that day of the week? So that's some of the weakness. But I think we can all agree, overall, policies are written to protect the agency, not the officer, right? It's a risk management strategy. That's why there's risk pools. So there's wording in plenty of policies, that de-escalation, again, it's hard to have, I say, a best definition of de-escalation when even the best experts in the field don't have an agreed upon definition. Yeah. So everybody, and to your guys' point, I thought this one, you're hey, 10 leaders or, managers, write it down 10 to 1, whatever they write still won't be what's in their policy. Right? You know what I mean? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because because what does policy mean in a moment of stress? And we can talk about policy right here.
Right.
We can, hey, let's evaluate that through a risk mitigation. What does that look like? Is this something officers can actually do? If we want them to do all these magical 10 things, can they do that? Probably sitting here. But what about under stress? What about when bullets are whizzing by their head? What about when things are emotionally intense?
With a non-compliant subject.
Right. Because things tend, I don't want to say always, but things tend to work really well when people are compliant, right? And they participate in what we ask of them. It's the non-compliant subjects, that tend to drive that. So it's really hard when there's no best definition. People disagree on what that looks like. And I think they forget that de-escalation encompasses more than what it's talking about, right? It is persuasion skills are different than de-escalation, right? If you really look at what that is, having a persuasion skill, understanding how to deploy active listening, how to, talk to somebody who is purposeful in nature. All those are very different, but it gets lumped under this definition, of de-escalation that may or may not be even tied to human performance.
Should
right?
be 10 different subcategories to actual de-escalation.
Yeah, how are we, and see, I don't think this is just me, and I am not a police practice policy expert. I think what's put in policy is what everybody wants to happen instead of, hey, let's talk about what we want in our training, to develop the skill sets for de-escalation. But we kind of hogtie officers, basically, when we put in there, shall, must, will. And I know some people put in there, if available or, whatever the word is, right? But that's subjective.
Yeah,
because
right.
The officer, evaluates that in that super tight moment, right? Then somebody going, well, absolutely no.
Yeah.
It was definitely available right here, and you missed that opportunity, right? Instead of that has nothing to do with what the officer perceived in that moment, the inferences they made with that behavior, maybe the information, and many times, of course, incomplete information they're drawing conclusions from in that moment. But that's why it belongs to them. And then this policy, to me, policies are guidelines. That's all they are. They're framework and they're guidelines. But sometimes we write de-escalation as if we're supposed to do all of these things instead of giving the officers the communication skill sets to build relationships. So not everybody's a naturally great communicator.
Yeah. And I think a really good example of that is, someone's pointing a gun at someone and they're trying to get their words out to get this, but the guy's coming up with the gun, right? Well, a policy might say, if practical, give a verbal warning.
Yeah.
But
Right.
you may not be able to.
Right.
One, because you're kind of locked, because it's hard to talk and actually use fine motor skills at the same time, like in pulling a trigger and those kinds of things, right? Making
you're
sure
stressed, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, very interesting thought process here with all
Yeah,
of this.
but somebody will evaluate that and say, you shoulda, woulda, coulda.
Yeah.
Right? That's the challenge. I think there's sometimes some weaknesses. And again, I'm talking about the struggles, right? There's some agencies, I just want to get this out, doing kick-ass work.
Yeah.
Man, they're doing, I would say, everything under the umbrella of honest accountability and human performance and accounting for those things. But we have to talk about the weaknesses that we all see, which is what we're here for, right? I mean, but a lack of understanding sometimes in just what you're talking about, like decision making under stress, like these compressed incidents, how the brain works. My one of the things, what do we always hear, like officers, like your special training made it different for you. Like, what does that mean, right?
Right.
And communication, for example, you've worked a crisis hotline in the past, right? But if you start deep diving, so I've gone to the academy, right? Like I go through my on-the-job training, like I'm kick loose. Let's imagine I'm on my day one. And across the country, everybody's got different variations of how much communication. Although it's pretty much, there's some type of de-escalation for the most part in an academy. Sometimes even introductory CIT, like an 8-hour CIT versus the 40 later. So let's say we've even got a little bit of experience, right? But day one, I'm on my own. My first call, I'm by myself. And it's a 7-year-old who's being molested. And we imagine every officer on that first day has the skill set to talk with that, right? That's a very particular type of communication. How do I build that relationship, right? We're not accounting for all the variations and the expectations. But in the US, to work a crisis hotline, like a suicide hotline, there's some places, it's 160 hours of training before you answer the phone, 100 hours of training before you can even say crisis hotline or suicide hotline. You model, you watch, you build a skill set. And what I would submit to you is an environment, a learning environment, right? But yeah, we expect officers to be on the street, talk to people in all sorts of, violent events, like sexual stuff. They do have stuff they're bringing to the table. They are traumatized. They are, escalated. They're all these things. And with 8 hours of training in communication, and sometimes classroom only with no deployment of skills, we're like, hey, be best. Be everything everybody needs in that moment. So part of it is, are we setting up officers for for success or failure based on, our training modalities, which is,
Well, and reasonable expectations
Right.
tied in with that.
Right.
Because going back, Vic, to that question you posed about poorly written policy, the thing that comes to my mind is agencies are fond of using overly broad language. Overly broad language. There's a case, and we may talk about it at the end, of a shooting that happened back east, and they found an officer, they indicted him and charged him with manslaughter on the shooting. And one of the things they said was, you failed to maintain an appropriate level of excellence. Now, to me, that could mean you didn't shine your shoes before you went out there that day.
What does that mean?
What does it mean?
Right.
Right? And I've told people, the good Lord only gave us 10 commandments, but the Phoenix PD has 1,300 pages in their policy manual. And so it's complicated. And what that means, and I would tell officers when I was actively working in the police union, I go, all of us on a given day go out every day and commit some policy violation, because when a 1,300 page book, how do you not?
Right. Well, and admittedly, let's say, you've read them, right? Like you can hey, we have a new policy, sign off. So once you sign off on that, it means you've read them.
You're supposed to have committed to memory.
And I'm like, that's not even how the brain works. And when it works, all of us sitting here. Now, not that we'd remember 1,300, but we could have hey, let's discuss de-escalation policy. Let's talk about our use of force policy. Is it consistent with Graham versus Connor? Hey, what does that look like? Mm-hmm. And then bullets are whizzing by our head. What does policy have to do with anything? It doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
You're in survival mode.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And people want to imagine differently, right? We're evaluating it with not bullets whizzing by our head. But that's why that human performance is so critical. Are we looking at the officer? Are we talking about human performance and limitations? That's all. That's really all stuff is tied to. But to your point, what does that mean? And is it tied to an outcome that somebody didn't like? Because that is very typical in law enforcement. We don't quote unquote like the outcome, whether it's reasonable or justified or not. But let's I'm talking from a reasonable standard, right? Let's imagine this is reasonable, justified uses of force, but somebody doesn't like the outcome.
That didn't look good.
Right. Well, but I would say to you, what use of force looks good? Violence is violence, right? I mean, no use of force is beautiful. That's not even a fair place to put it. Violence is very visceral sometimes, right? Not just for the people watching, but for the officer, we had to do stuff. And where's that conversation? People aren't high-fiving each other as people imagine. I can't go wait to go shoot somebody.
Right.
That's not, you know what? If somebody goes 20 years without shooting somebody, good for them. Good for them.
Yeah.
And if somebody has to get in a shooting with justified reason, hey, man, that's what they had to do. And then they did their job. One of my frustration points, and I look at, internal affairs and questions and stuff like that, but I personally struggle, Nicole, sitting here talking to you.
Right.
I'm going to just use me as an example. So I've been a cop for 25 years, right? I've trained for 25 years for that moment that I may have to engage in force, right? And I may have to take somebody's life based on my perspective of that event. And now, by proxy of doing my job, doing what I've trained for, doing what's been asked of me, and doing technically what the community wanted of me in the beginning, right? That's why we have police officers to uphold law and order, and we're peace officers, right? But now I'm a criminal. And I'm not an attorney, don't get me wrong. There's justifications for use of force, in statute and stuff like that. But my point is, by doing what you have asked of me, wanted of me, and what I've trained for my entire career, now I'm a problem.
You're standing in the gap for everybody. You're taking on that, which very few have said, yes, I will do. I'll take the risk, right? I'll take the bullet. I'll jump in the middle of that fight.
Right. But now I'm the problem.
Now all of a sudden you're the bad person.
Right. And if you can't remember
because you didn't have the high level of excellence.
Right. I mean, again, there's a lot of these, I'm not trying to slam on policy, but here's the reality. There's a lot of them that are catch-all, they're subjective. They're that, when I don't like something, I have a policy to throw somebody to, and I just don't think that is appropriate, for officers. That's not a meetable standard. That's, again, take something so basic as the proactive police work, and I'm just going to use something we don't have quotas, but I'm just going to use something arbitrary, hey, 5 stops is good this week, but next week you did 5 and that's not good. What does that mean? And use of force and de-escalation is no different. Well, you didn't do X, Y, Z. What about the officer's perspective of that event? Why, what did they perceive? Why did they not engage in a traditional de-escalation? Part of that's evaluating human behavior. What does that look like? What did you see in the moment that you chose what you did? Why did you pick that communication style over something else? But sometimes they can't answer that because we learn by patterns. It's inherent, it's subconscious. We read behavior for a living. Police officers human beings read behavior all day long, right? And then we have the added levels of, threat presentations. What does that look like? And that's all in our head. And then we are supposed to articulate, hey, why'd you do what you did? And sometimes that's actually not articulable. It's very subconscious. And sometimes people can articulate it and it's great. Welcome to what do we know about human behavior? It varies and everybody's different. And even individual people can have different responses in similar circumstances. You just never know. But again, you're held to that standard. If you shoulda, woulda, coulda done something different, you shoulda, woulda, coulda had this amazing, perfect outcome. You shoulda, woulda, coulda done this. But there's headlines out there, for example, activist headlines. I don't care if it was reasonable. I don't care if it was justified. We don't need to see another black man punched. I don't care if it was reasonable. That's a standard, but I don't care because I don't like it.
Right. Well, and that's at that point, the law enforcement agency is thrust into the position of trying to reason with an unreasonable person at that point. Because when they say, I don't care if it was reasonable, that's exactly where you're at. It's like
But that can also be, think about that. That can be emotionally driven or that can be purposeful message for that person. We don't, everybody brings their own stuff to the table and everybody has a role, right? Mm-hmm. And if your role is, an activist per se, you have a particular lane you're in and you're going to go do what you're going to do. And in some cases, it's not even emotionally driven. It's just hey, this is where I'm at and this is what I'd like to see. And anything outside of this doesn't work in my world. Right. That exists too. So, Now what I love, and this is what I actually love about this, is I think we should be building relationships. Like, I know somebody's going to lose their mind about this. I don't believe in community trust. A community can't trust you. That's an entity. You can build trust with individuals in your community, but you can't have community trust. A community as a whole cannot trust you, right? But what we can do is build relationships with individuals and educate individuals.
Correct.
Some people they only know what they know. They've never been exposed to different stuff. Hell, as cops, that's us too. Sometimes we only know what we know. Right? And then given information, it, kind of goes into that bank, all the file folders that you got, right? And then you have other things to think about and other things to evaluate and, other things to compare to. And, we kind of straight off de-escalation, but again, it's no different than evaluating an officer under that quote unquote traditional de-escalation interest umbrella. Was it something that fit there? Was it something that's outside of there? What do I have to evaluate them? We talk about, like, our program for de-escalation, we're not quote unquote diagnosis heavy, especially, like, we'll get that, like, can a therapist give somebody a wrong diagnosis? Absolutely, right? You can only diagnose on what you know, right? We are very behavior focused. What is that person doing? Why did I get called and what am I going to do with it? Do I have the legal authority to do anything? What's really interesting from the public side is they imagine we have a lot more options than we really do, right? What can I do as an officer when I go to a call? What are my options?
So that feeds into a question we have here, and I think that's a perfect segue into the next question.
I'm ready.
So what do you feel are some of the myths surrounding de-escalation, and are there specific things that perpetuate or feed these myths? Could it be uninformed police managers, uninformed politicians, community activists, Hollywood?
I love that Hollywood. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
God, they've ruined it for us all. They think we're getting DNA back within 45 minutes and solved a crime. So it's definitely hit communication.
It doesn't work that way?
No, I know, it's so weird. But yeah, there's a whole lot of myths about just communication in general. And one is by sending officers to this quote unquote de-escalation training, any de-escalation training, now they can de-escalate everyone.
You're an expert.
Hey, here you go. Here's my my magical de-escalation fairy dust. So, there it goes. And now therefore everyone will be de-escalated. There's that myth, right? There's a myth that we actually de-escalate people. I like people to think bigger than that. What makes you think I can de-escalate anyone? A person has to de-escalate themselves. One of the exercises I do in my class, when I talk about de-escalation, I tell people, I want you to imagine a time in your life that you've been extremely angry. I want you to think about that moment in time, that you've been very, very angry, very upset, very hurt. And I usually ask a student, you can tell me, like, I'm a therapist, right? Is it okay if I pat your shoulder? And they're like, oh, it's okay, Nicole, right? And I say, okay, you're a little disruptive in that moment. I get called to talk to you. Me, Nicole, you're angry. Maybe I even know you. I said, you're going to de-escalate because I showed up? Or if I pat you on the shoulder? No. Like, we don't even like to be touched by people we love when we're upset. A lot of people, when they're super angry, a spouse, partner, whatever, goes to hug them, they go like this. Their kids go to touch them, they go like that. And yet there's a narrative in some of the training in law enforcement that we should be all touchy-feely with people. No. I talk about risk assessment. There's no risk assessments. I shouldn't say no, that's a bit too broad. Rarely is there a risk assessment when it comes to applying de-escalation strategies. That still requires risk assessment. What is that person likely to do? What does that look like? The grief example I gave, I tell people all the time, if you want to do a risk assessment on a grief notification, one of your risk assessments, at some point you're probably going to get attacked. Are you going to arrest that person? No, probably not. What are you going to do? You're going to let them dump all that emotion and sit them down. They may not even remember they did it, but they'll apologize for doing it. Like, officer, I didn't mean to attack you. I'm so sorry. Like, because you just told them their kid got killed in the crosswalk, right? Well, that's a risk assessment too. But, de-escalation assessments, like, one, we can always do it. It's always going to be successful. That some communicator is going to show up and that is going to work. That's not reasonable. De-escalation also, I think, like I said, gets packaged as one thing when there are layers and nuances, right? Different types of communication, persuasion skills and questioning styles and interview techniques and how we talk to people. There's one, that active listening skills work for everybody. No, they don't. No, they don't. Some people are going to just explode at you when you attempt to explore, like, emotional anything with them, right? Some people, they increase in escalation if they're talking about what's bugging them. A lot of people don't. A lot of people, sure, they will dampen their responses as we talk to them. They're dumping some of that energy, but crisis is energy, right? So where are we stuck in law enforcement? We tend to, and I don't think it's purposeful sometimes, but to compress people in crisis. Sit down, don't move, stop moving. What's great in therapy? Walking therapy. Why? Because if somebody's getting asked up, you're walking. But it's hard for us as law enforcement to sometimes look outside the box because of all the use of force stuff we have to consider and those behaviors to go, can I let somebody pace? Can I let them walk around? So what if they're yelling and screaming? What does that mean? What if they're flailing their arms? Like, is it okay? Sometimes not, right? But I mean, there's that kind of stuff. But I think the biggest one is just that de-escalation will always be successful under the model that somebody imagines, and it's
the magic
not.
wand solution.
Right, absolutely.
Right.
I do. I always talk about magic de-escalation
Right.
fairy dust. Like, now that I'm quote unquote trained, I've gone to a class, now everybody's going to de-escalate. Or simply, this one's a little frustrating for me working on the clinician side of things, like I can de-escalate a diagnosis. Like, what does that even mean? I think where we've gotten sideways in training is imagining diagnosis and crisis have any relationship. You know what's a diagnosis for? Long-term treatment. You know what crisis intervention is for? That immediate crisis.
Right.
Are there sometimes it's helpful to know a diagnosis? It's meant to, yeah. If you knew somebody had autism, if you know somebody had some type of developmental disability, they're nonverbal. What are you doing? You're adjusting your communication ahead of time for that person, right? But a lot of the stuff, it's just, what's their behavior? Why'd they get called? I mean, a person is not the label of their diagnosis. That's what frustrates me, right? What if I have a diagnosis that reduces violence? Some diagnoses reduces the potential for violence. But can I still choose violence as a human being? Sure. Some diagnoses increase violence, right?
Yes.
But can I choose not to be violent? Also, yes, right? So I think it's just we've provided people, maybe they just have an expectation they just don't know is not reasonable when it comes to that de-escalation will always be successful, or we can quote unquote, talk everybody down. That's not realistic, right? It's not realistic.
Yeah, one of the things that came to my mind on this question is you have a controversial shooting. Obviously, it hits the media for whatever reason. The community or certain elements of the community get spun up, and then they're doing a press conference, and they go, the police should have de-escalated that. And tied in with that, I think on a lot of police departments, it puts management on the defense, and they don't know how to address that. And so they go into this placation mode. We need to placate these people. Oh, we're gonna do this now and ramp up this new training program. When in reality, maybe 2 rounds center mass was the appropriate de-escalation there.
Yeah, but again, that even goes back to your definition question. Some people think rounds coming out don't fit a de-escalation model.
Yeah, right.
Even though somebody could say, hey, they're no longer doing what they didn't hurt this person, we're able to diffuse it, but it required, some things require that. And, with de-escalation too, I think, because it's become this magic panacea, the model is, if I create space, create time, create distance, that is always going to be the magic answer. And the truth is it's not. No. Some situations, as we all know sitting here, and hopefully the public understands this too at some point, require immediate intervention, a swift application of force that's safest for everybody. I mean, it's required. My safety counts too. I think that's also what's forgotten. My safety counts as a police officer. Now, do I think some training has created and taken our safety out of it? Yes, I do. I think it has made my safety, all of our lives are important, right? All of them. They're important. Mine too. But I think some training modalities have infected the fact that they don't think that my safety is important. I should abandon my own safety to build relationships. Truth is, you can build relationships without doing that. It doesn't mean there's not cost benefits trade-offs to everything, everything that we do. But we have to have conversations about everybody. And sometimes what's safest for everyone is that immediate use of force. Talking is not the answer. It won't be the answer. It's not going to be the answer. Time is not the answer to everything. Time is a competitive resource.
Right.
That is all it is. And I tell people all the time, again, outside de-escalation, if you think time's the answer to everything, why don't you take a look at Uvalde? Why don't you tell me what happened in those minutes, right? Because time's competitive. We only have so much of it, right? And I would submit to you, if I can create space, create time, create distance, and give an opportunity, ideally somebody in crisis, can that emotion, yeah, of course. I mean, I think Vic knows this, right? I would never say this out loud to anybody, but we have kind of a mantra as therapists, right? No feeling is final. What is de-escalation? Can that feeling change? That's what we're trying to do. I can't say to somebody, hey buddy, no feeling's final. You're gonna get over it, it's gonna be fine. That's not how life works, right? But can I, in that interaction, can what they're feeling change? Can I get them potentially, if they're not compliant, into where their feelings drop? Something changes to be more compliant. Yeah, maybe sometimes. I think we're great at what we do. But that's just part of the conversation of evaluating all of that. De-escalation, mental health intervention. It requires risk assessment. some people are violent, right? And I mean, let's be honest, most of the violence in the whole world has nothing to do with mental illness. There's true violence that walks the stairs. People, their goal is violence, right?
Correct.
How do you de-escalate violence? And I'm not saying there's an answer to that. We would probably have an idea of what that is, but for somebody to look in the mirror and say, how would a police officer de-escalate a violent person, somebody actively engaged in violence? Like, what does that look like? Is it words? Most of the time, no, right? You can't there's like these, Vaughn, my boss, Vaughn Kleem, he writes great articles, right? But he wrote about basically like the conditions of de-escalation, like the 5 C's of de-escalation, requiring containment, control, the contact, like communication, and then the important one, the cooperation of the subject, right? And we talk about those things, and how does that influence de-escalation? Within that, how do I persuade? What is the best communication style? Because my favorite thing, again, when I think about active listening is not the answer to everything. Active listening is the answer to many things, but not all things. How do you deal with somebody who is something called like a cognitive aggressor, a purposeful violent individual, somebody like, think of a paid protester, a constitutionalist, a sovereign citizen, different goal orientation, not emotionally driven. How do you de-escalate, with active listening, emotionally based communication, somebody who doesn't have that emotional state, but somebody's gonna be like, you shoulda, woulda, coulda done active listening skills on what?
Right.
On what? Different communication. Where's that conversation? We have to look at the nuances so officers are held to a standard they can potentially meet and be evaluated against. Because if we just blanket this, as unfortunately sometimes happens, officers are indicted, they are put in jail. I mean, God, juries are imagining, they're doing their own tactical AAR on officers, and I don't like the order and the use of force, so go to prison. I don't like the fact that you didn't do de-escalation long enough. What's long enough?
As we sit here and talk about this, I think about how difficult a police officer's job is, right? In doing the job for so long, I truly get that, like in my soul, but you're talking about cooperation, you're talking about behavior, so let's talk a little bit about mental illness, right? The component as it relates to de-escalation, because you're talking about people, right? And police officers now more than ever are really having to contend with the mentally ill, right? Mm-hmm. They don't keep them in prisons anymore. They don't keep them in institutions.
Right.
They are out on the street, and we make contact with them every day. So how does this impact the use of some of these de-escalation techniques when we're talking about this subgroup of people?
Well, I think it puts officers in an unfair advantage. Like, again, some people have a little bit more clinical background, that's fine, but, I educate people. I might have my background, like, for example, as a therapist. I'm not a therapist when I'm on duty as a cop, right?
Right.
I mean, so it's something too, like, our role as law enforcement is very different than the role of a clinician.
But it's a tool that you can use.
Oh, sure. If you can find out, like I would submit to, like say you're dealing with somebody, maybe they're actively suicidal, right? Maybe you can't get the information who their therapist is. Can you open up those resources? Can you help them out? Because people imagine, there's some calls we can't leave. I think we can all agree on that, right? Mm-hmm. People really think, you'd be surprised how many people think we can leave every call, like as cops. Because if you just wouldn't have stayed, this wouldn't have happened. Okay, now sometimes we are able to disengage and go, okay. I just think it sets officers up for the fact that, again, we imagine that officers, just because of mental illness, one, there's some expectations that people who have mental illness, by the nature of having it, are undeserving of a force response. We don't use force against mental illness. Force is used against behavior, right? So what is that doing? So when force is used against somebody with a diagnosis,
that's a good point.
Where's the conversation about that? Because I think everybody here could agree, certain diagnoses might have, it's not always violent behavior, it's volatile behavior sometimes, or unstable. You had made the comment about seriously mentally ill, right? The SMI population. A lot of times with SMI, where's the conversation that sometimes people with SMI, they just have fewer regulation skills. They might go into crisis more frequently, right? They don't have sometimes the same critical or consequential reasoning that you or I do, right? Many times SMI is like that person's on disability. That's really impacting their life. But we send an officer over who's got to problem solve with somebody they maybe can't connect to. That person maybe has an ability to not be connected to, I think we put officers in an unfair thing. I mean, across the country, if you look, there are agencies that are no longer going to suicidal subjects, right? Unless there's a firearm involved. They're not going. Why? Because officers are going to prison for completion of the suicide by cop loop. Right. But I think it's unfair to imagine, because we teach officers about diagnoses, that means they're going to solve the problem. Like when somebody's in crisis, they're in crisis. To me, again, their diagnosis is not as relevant at that point. Why are they in crisis? What happened? What happened? What is going on with them? What have they ingested that might interfere with my ability to connect? You know? Now, I think it's helpful if we as officers understand which areas might be a little more challenging, right? Like, we know anything with a psychotic feature, anybody who's in psychosis, but even then, the majority of psychosis isn't violent, but it can be volatile. Like, what officers, think back, even us right here,
Right.
who was really comfortable the first time they dealt with somebody in a totally different reality? Like, that can make an officer feel really uncomfortable. What do I do? I mean, remember,
Well,
like,
even just going through the CIT training with some of the scenarios that they put us in, like
Right.
listening to the voices, that was, for me, that was kind of creepy.
right. I mean, and so to help officers understand what that may look like, to experience that, but then the question still becomes, how do you break through an auditory hallucination? What does that look like? What do you do in inpatient psychiatry? What does an officer have time to do? You know, a lot of times we're just resource connectors in a way, right?
Right.
Like, how much mental illness is rampant in the homeless population, right? There's a lot. Unreported sexual assault, like all sorts of stuff.
Drug-induced.
Absolutely. You know, and then where's the conversation about drug use? You know, Nicole's not here to say decriminalize drugs. Never hear that from me. But my point is, what about when it's criminal and also in the DSM? Now where are we, right? What about helping officers understand the majority of drug use comes from trauma? Like, people don't slide typically into mind obliterating addiction because they're social users. Like, you got to have something stronger in the brain than that picture, that smell, that taste, whatever, you know? But by proxy, we've become default therapists, right? Like, we're the default resource. But then when we don't handle it, quote unquote, and I just say, you know, in quotes, right, what does that mean? What do we expect them to do? So one, reasonable expectations for officers is critical. I jokingly call it the other SWAT team, social workers and therapists, right? I've seen great success with mobile crisis teams, blended mobile crisis teams. I've seen some of them not be so successful. It just depends on the implementation of the program. But I personally don't think the answer is to remove cops from the conversation to a degree, because my friends and colleagues don't want to go to unstable things.
Right.
You know, so I mean, I think that's a big, like, we could do an 8-hour class. Now, I'm not taking like just a conversation on the realities of dealing with individuals who are mentally ill. I mean, because what is it? On any calendar year in the US, it's about 48% of individuals are diagnosed with a mental illness. So it doesn't mean they won't go into remission. It doesn't mean, you know, anything like that. But I mean, you know, you're just shy of 50% of people may have a diagnosis.
Right.
You know, but I think helping officers understand the diagnosis isn't as relevant as they would imagine in that crisis moment is one thing. Because again, long-term treatment, why do I want to know what's wrong? Because so I can help them long-term.
Yeah, I think that was a really good point you made, right? Because with the diagnosis, we're talking about a long-term type of, you know, conversation and working with someone, but we're really dealing with a crisis, right? And we really got to deal with the crisis before we can even think about the diagnosis.
Right.
And what we might be able to help in that direction at all whatsoever, right?
It's reading behavior. Like, again, like legitimate public safety and government interest. What can I do? Why did I call them? What am I going to do with it? Because the reality, like, what are my options as a cop? I can go there, like, so I respond. There I am. Boop. I can stay there and do what? I can arrest somebody. That exists. I can do a mental health hold. That exists too. I can kind of stay there and stabilize because really it doesn't meet anything, right? And then extract myself. I can leave because I got no legal authority to do anything in this call. I mean, I think the public thinks I have more options than that, but I really don't. I go there, I only have so many options. I can go and leave, I can go and make an arrest, and potentially a mental health hold if it meets that. You know, and there's some nuances to that, but I don't have a lot more options. Like, it's a paid role tied to, you know, the government interest, right? So I only have so many options. But I think officers have been held, again, to this unmeetable standard when it comes to dealing with mentally ill, because a forced narrative is, and I'm talking all mental illness, I'm lumping it all together in this conversation. Like, everybody that's in this mental illness bubble never acquires force. And it's like, well, it's not that simple. Because again, and I repeat this all the time to people, we don't use force against diagnosis, we use force against behavior. And sometimes that person does have a mental illness. But guess what? Sometimes they don't. I mean, welcome to use of force, you know? And sometimes you don't even know. What about when you have no idea they're mentally ill? Like, you have no idea they have a diagnosis. And what happens? In hindsight, somebody's like, oh my God, they had this. And look at what you did.
You should have known better.
Well, and tied into everything we've been discussing here, one of the things that popped in my head is a lot of times when police officers are thrust into these rapidly evolving scenarios, not of their own choosing, but they had to respond to the call, and the worst occurs and we have to use force or maybe shoot somebody, the mental illness component is often found out about after the fact. But what do the headlines say? Police shot
and killed mentally ill person.
Right.
Of whatever, or unarmed mentally ill person,
you
or
horrible
whatever
people.
it is.
And I remember a call I was on one time in the wintertime where a guy was barricaded up and he was suicidal, and it was the talky talk. And before he came out, he downed a bunch of automotive antifreeze. And we got the fire department out there, and we were breaking down the perimeter, and one of the sergeants just said, well, at least he ain't gonna freeze to death. And but it's just that sometimes, despite your best efforts, you're never gonna control the outcome.
Right.
To a satisfactory degree.
Yeah, because also that term right there, let's just say satisfactory, positive, desirable.
Yeah.
That's also very nuanced. That's different to any people. Like even when we talk about use of force in general, right? And we say, hey, that was a reasonable, justified use of force. Let's say everybody agrees. That still impacts a person's family.
Oh, sure.
I mean, of course, you know what I'm saying? Like,
On both sides,
right.
especially in a deadly force encounter.
Right. So like, that's why all of this is so nuanced. And there's, of course, like we work under the legal side of things, right? Like we have to work under that umbrella of reasonableness and what that officer perceived and the inferences and everything that they made. And somebody may not, quote, like the outcome. That doesn't mean that outcome wasn't reasonable. It doesn't mean the officer could have done anything else, whether you wanted them to or not. But it just that's what happened. And sometimes they can explain it because they have enough to do that, and sometimes they're not able to explain every single thing they did. But I think if the public could really understand that we have to respond to behavior, it's not about a diagnosis.
It's behavior driven.
Yeah, it's behavior driven. Like
Yeah.
why did we get called, and what are we going to do with it? Because we can get called to stuff we have zero legal authority to intervene. Okay, and then what would you like me to do? What would you like me to do? Because that's a question. And I'll be like, hey, help me understand what you think I can do. Help me understand is one of my favorite questions. But help me understand, what do you think I can do if I'm talking to you? What do you imagine I can do with this person? And you may not like it, but maybe I can educate a person on, hey, this is the reality of what I can legally do. And you may not like it, but at least it's from an educated perspective. Because sometimes people also imagine I can do different things than I can in my role as a police officer. That exists too.
Well, and I used to tell people too about dealing with, mentally ill subjects, because the police departments often get tasked with doing what we call mental health pickup orders. A person's off their meds, they've missed their check-in with their counselor,
Actively suicidal,
or their family calls, and
they can't handle them.
Yeah, and sometimes, but we get these mental health pickup orders, and it is literally a court order empowering the police to go pull that person out of their home by force if necessary, restrain them, and take them to an urgent psychiatric care unit for a check-in, for a mandatory 72-hour hold so they can get stabilized. And I tell people, when I talk to them, and I said, listen, think about this. The person's family, who they know the best, who they trust the most, who has the greatest rapport in the world with them, call us because sometimes they are scared to death of this monster they are now dealing with. We've showed up to where the families outside the house go, he's in there, he might have a knife, blah, blah, blah. And then, so the cops are thrust into this very tenuous, volatile situation. And I said, think about this. We show up in a marked patrol car wearing a full uniform and a gun belt, and even a person in an altered state of mind generally knows that those are the people that take people to jail and put them in handcuffs. How do you expect us to achieve a better outcome than their own family who raised them and knows and loves them?
Right.
That's what we're dealing with. That's the dynamic we're dealing with a lot of times.
Take the title out of it for a second, like the hold for a second. And I don't mean this in a facetious manner at all, but is it illegal to be crazy?
No.
No. What's illegal? Breaking the law, right? Or if you have met the qualifications for a title, especially if the state's doing the title, like stuff's gotten real, right? Like I may as a family member be like, oh my God, or as a therapist, right? But if the state's coming in, like state of Arizona's like, hey, we have a problem, like that says a lot, right? But it is not illegal to experience any of this stuff. What's illegal is breaking the law. Or if you meet, danger to self, danger to others, or acutely or gravely disabled, right?
Which is what it usually is. Yeah.
Right. And for give officer, this is where it's like, we got to give officers a little grace. what's danger to self and danger to others for them doesn't usually meet what a title is. It doesn't, right? Because they're looking at different, they don't have the training like say like Vic or I would, and we look at, okay, what is actually danger to self and danger to others? What does that mean? And they look at some behaviors that may not qualify as that, right? But they're like, hey, like I think I need to title this person, like it's a risk, they're volatile, like whatever it is. And the public, this would help them too, I think, Don't imagine because we title somebody as cops, they're not out 6 hours later. If I take somebody and title mental health hold, that I do a mental health hold, they may not be released within 6 hours. It doesn't mean they're being held for 72. Voluntariness overrides involuntariness. So if I'm like, hey, you know what, you took me in, and I'm like, hey, you know what, look, I have a therapist. Look, I will go see them on Monday. I will re-engage. Like I got this, like I was frustrated. And unless
Didn't
there's
like my
something
meds.
so flagrant, right, that they're like, I don't know, like like it's voluntary, right? But I've also seen, and I'm not bashing mobile crisis teams by any means, but understand I've worked mobile crisis, but I've seen mobile crisis teams leave somebody in active psychosis. They do nothing with them. They're in full-blown active psychosis.
Yeah.
And they're like, sorry, too bad, so sad.
People talking into the air, eating out of trash cans.
Yeah, their shirt's like the manna
Yeah.
of heaven or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
And they're like, yeah, no, like, where's that? But then, okay, so the clinicians can't do anything.
Right.
But I am supposed to as a cop?
Well-
like, what does that mean?
Right, and let me kind of dovetail into that. We talk about the diagnosis. So you have somebody who's been under the care of a mental health professional, be it a psychologist, psychiatrist, and they've been working with them for years, and they can't figure them out. And yet, as a police officer thrown into that situation, I'm supposed to have it figured out and squared away and walk away with a favorable outcome. And when it doesn't, you throw it all on my back. How is that fair?
Yeah, it definitely doesn't mean honest accountability. I
Right.
submit to you that,
Right.
That's what's so challenging. And I would submit we don't give officers all the tools that they would need. Like we need to give them, I think, additional training in being a hell of a lot more comfortable with somebody who is delusional and in psychosis. Giving them tools. There are tools to potentially, doesn't mean always, but to potentially get through to somebody in auditory hallucinations. Can I break through some of that? Doesn't mean it always works, but there's some tools, right? We don't give them that. It can be very disconcerting and uncomfortable to deal with that. We imagine that they're going to have these, I'll just go to like that favorable outcome with somebody that has made them really uncomfortable. That honestly, like I say the word and it's not demeaning. Psychosis can be kind of creepy sometimes, not violent. I'm just talking like it's very disconcerting.
Yeah.
If you're not once you're used to it, it's really not. But when it's new, right? It's hard for people to understand that. Even it can be hard for some clinicians. They're like, you got to work your way in to be real comfortable working in patient psychiatry. Like that's eye-opening, right? If you ever get the opportunity to do that, it's flipping eye-opening. But yet officers are supposed to come in and go like, what am I supposed to do with an individual who is, I'm talking a textbook psychosis, right? The religious delusions, hearing voices, like through the radio, God's talking to them.
Dysregulated speech,
Yeah.
not making any
fragmented,
sense at all.
Not understanding that
Yeah.
they can probably kind of hear you, but what's coming out of their mouth is super fragmented. Syntax is wrong. Grammar structure is wrong. Sometimes complete gibberish, right? And what are they supposed to do? Again, not meetable expectations sometimes, because that person is not always breaking the law. Sometimes they're just a little volatile, but they haven't done anything criminal. And we're supposed to just automatically think, we as police are supposed to step in and magically fix that problem. There needs to be a lot more conversation, I think, on what hat somebody wants us to wear. It doesn't mean abandon mental health professionals. I would never want to abandon my colleagues on a mobile crisis team. If they need a stable, safe's a relative term, but if they need a stable, safe situation to do their job, we should be able to provide that for them, right?
Right.
As law enforcement. But it's a lot more nuance in that, and there's a lot more layers to that.
Yeah.
And we're the default answer to those problems. We're the default,
Yeah.
Very
So,
true.
and again, to kind of go on our next question, what do you feel are some of the biggest misunderstandings held by citizens as it relates to de-escalation?
Let's just say it's always going to work. That they will always have. And when I say positive outcome, I'm using that term in that it will always be rectified without use of force. That they imagine any one of us. I'm taking all officers interchangeably across the country right now. Like any one of us can show up and always have a verbal exchange only to that outcome. That's not the reality of this job. there is not one best communicator that can connect with everyone, right?
Right.
And I think they need to understand the layers. It's not that they don't know, because the truth is they know this exists. They're just not applying it to this world, right? Because there are people that are too checked out to comply with de-escalation. They are non-compliant by proxy if they can't comply because they're very, I call it contaminated in the brain. They cannot comply with anything, whether it's a medical emergency, mental health emergency, whatever it is. They can't comply with de-escalation. They cannot follow commands. There's nothing they can do. So if you have to do something, it's probably going to be a use of force event if you can't leave, right? Because you got to intervene. And we don't talk enough about purposeful individuals. Goal orientation is different than Miriu, right? My goal is to get arrested. My goal is to make a big show of that. I am a sovereign citizen. My goal is, you're my next YouTube video, right? My goal is to disrupt you. And sometimes within that process, they use something called manufactured emotion. It's fake. They're yelling, they're screaming, they're swearing, but they are not actually angry. So how do you deploy, somebody's going to look at that from the outside and go, oh, active listening skills would have fixed that. You should have engaged in some type of emotionally based communication. Well, where's the conversation about officers evaluate that and have determined, hey, that is most likely manufactured emotion. You can't deploy active listening skills on somebody who has fake emotional, right? But I can have a goal very different than yours. How do you de-escalate somebody else's goal? How do you de-escalate a goal, right? Where's that conversation? Don't imagine if somebody is engaged in actively violent behavior that words always fix that. That's not the time for word deployment. You may have to be doing other things. Somebody engaged in active, like active assault. Like, oh, sure, I'm sure somebody could yell, stop. Yeah, well, maybe 1 out of a million, that's going to work. But that's not the reality, right? If somebody is engaged in active assault, active crime, right, we need to understand that that's not the time for words. Like, officers sometimes get there and have to immediately intervene. And that's, I think that's probably one of the bigger struggles. It's that immediate intervention of force that people, like sometimes people that don't spend a lot of time in this world really struggle with. They just don't understand sometimes that's what is necessary at the time.
Now for those, my follow-up question, now for those who are in that world, in other words, they are in law enforcement or they have been in law enforcement and they have ascended that ladder and they now occupy a position above everybody else, what do you feel that those people, administrators, commanders, chiefs, etc., need to understand in general with regards to actually crafting policy regarding de-escalation?
Yeah, that's a tough one on policy. And I'm just going to be honest because I don't know, because again, I don't work in the policy world very much. I don't know if there's a policy that would be crafted as what is the best policy for de-escalation, right? I don't know me personally, I don't know what that could actually look like. But the crafting of the policy should have simply this, the reality of human performance. Can the officers actually meet some of these things? Are we basically holding them, is the policy a standard of performance somebody can't meet? Right? Are like we setting them up for failure of something nobody could meet? Not an officer, not any human being on this earth could meet like the structure of what is in this policy. From a crisis decision-making point, from a compressed, from like decision-making under stress. Are we setting them up? Are we creating some type of decision-making model that leaders might, well, I call it more managers, but
That's
difference.
Right. That basically this decision-making model that's implemented would work when we're all sitting here, but not in a time of stress. Are we holding them to a standard they can't meet because decision-making under stress or traumatic stress or compressed decision-making couldn't unfold within that model? Are we putting in the fluffy words like I'm talking about that have changed the standard so much the officer couldn't meet it if they wanted to? Are we holding them, again, it's that, like I said, that honest accountability. Are we creating a policy that no one could meet?
Right, so you're setting them up for failure right from the beginning instead of trying to set them up for success by making it too restrictive.
Yeah, so that ties into, and I just jotted down, a policy that's realistic versus unrealistic, and understanding that before any policy goes into print, what happens? It's reviewed by attorneys.
But attorneys may not put it under human performance. This is a much more broad conversation to your point, because it's not just like leadership that needs the education on this. It's risk management and risk pools and union reps and use of force review, like if you have civilian use of force review, right? It is attorneys, it's like whoever your, sometimes it's a risk pool attorney, right? But whatever the attorney is for the city,
right?
They're obviously looking out for the city. Like risk pool management strategy is a thing, right? But the reality is, if we're going to craft policy, it needs to be under that human performance world, human performance and human performance limitations. But if an attorney isn't isn't versed on that, for example.
That's my point. Yeah,
and,
they
you know,
need to be looped
to this
in.
point, like, you know, like obviously I talked a little bit earlier about my boss, Vaughn Kleem, you know, the president of Force Science. Vaughn, if I call him an attorney, he'd smack me upside the head. He's a cop with a law degree, right?
Right.
But to the point, he has classes where he educates attorneys.
Right.
And, you know, like legal and risk pool and stuff like that. From the standard that they work in and that they would understand about crafting policy under honest accountability and human performance. And of course, he works the other side of that, you know, can officers predict the lawfulness of their encounter, you know, and what that looks like. So it's not that the information is out there, but also at some point, like, we have to seek, each of us individually has to seek that information and seek to grow and seek to be educated, because sometimes we only know what we know. But if I could do anything, that would be that the policy needs to be written under human performance. Are we giving officers a metric they can actually meet? Is it something, and not them as an officer, as a human being, because that is forgotten. Like, you know, there's no job I know, like police work, you put the badge on and it deflects basic scientific principles. Like, those don't apply because you're special. Right? Now, yes, I agree we are special. That, no one will ever take away that people who choose to be in the military and law enforcement, like the first responder world, I think are special by nature of choosing the job, because you take a bullet for somebody who would piss on you if you're on fire. It is a selfless job. You would sacrifice yourself. Yeah, you're special because of that. But your brain's not magically special because you put a badge on.
Right,
Are you
right.
susceptible to things? So that's why we have to we're human beings. There's no super secret office or police stuff. There's human beings who took the job of police officers, and the policies need to be written to account for human performance and the potential limitations of what that looks like. And so that's what would be best for officers.
I used to tell people all the time when I was in the union and doing pressers and stuff, and I'd say, our police officers are drawn from the pool of humanity. They are subject to all the same flaws, foibles, and fears as anybody else in society.
Right.
And people, they see the uniform and they go, oh, this guy has special powers. This guy has special powers. And they're going to get the de-escalation fairy dust, to use your term.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, and
it
so,
works. It's there.
Yeah. So,
You know, I've always thought with de-escalation, especially with police officers, that you can't de-escalate anyone unless you de-escalated yourself, right? Which kind of ties right into emotional intelligence. And for people that have not heard of emotional intelligence, I would say like a basic understanding of emotional intelligence is like your ability to recognize and understand emotions in yourself. As a police officer, your ability to recognize and understand emotions in other people. And then maybe your ability to manage your relationship based off those emotions, right? So the question really is, with regard to EQ, could you comment on what you feel like more might be some important aspects regarding mental state of officers that we expect to employ these de-escalation techniques?
Well, sure. I love that point, to be honest. And also on that point, you know, at Force Science, one of the things is actually in our de-escalation class, and actually in our definition of de-escalation, is the component of officer self-regulation. Are we at I just call it like an optimal performance state for what we're doing, right? Because it is important to self-regulate. I look at it this way. We would never put an officer out on the street without giving them firearms training, right? You would just watch a video and be like, go forth and be free, right? It's a skill. So why would we put them out there without self-regulation skills? Like, we do get exposed to stuff that makes us fearful, that makes us uncomfortable, that disgusts us, that stuff's so horrible and heinous. Like, your brain is like, it's just, what? Like, how did somebody do that to another person? And some people, they come to the table with the skill to manage that, right? Like, they're born naturally more able to do so.
more resilience.
Right, yeah, but some people don't have that. And so, to your point, self-regulation is a skill. We have to give officers the skills. And I get it, we're running out of training time. We can take existing training time and work self-regulation skills and these resilience skills into the current training paradigm. Like, are we teaching breathing skills and grounding skills? Are we actually vetting those skills to make sure they actually work in practice? Or, because I would submit officer wellness as a cottage industry, and there's a lot of stuff out there that's actually harmful, right? That will harm a person or increase suicidality or increase like emotional dysregulation. So it's incumbent upon us to, one, vet some of this stuff, make sure the skills are good, but then allow officers the time to practice the skills, like integrate it into our training. Because if you are self-regulated, again, nothing's like an absolute blanket statement, but you are more likely to be able to evaluate that behavior,
Sure.
look at it, maybe choose the best communication in that moment. And I'm talking a little more in the uncompressed state, like as you're problem solving,
Yeah.
like then you can evaluate that as necessary to be able to engage in, okay, I think this person needs crisis communication now, maybe they need a little bit of this, like maybe this is what would be better, all things considered. How do I meet them where they're at? What does that look like? What would be a best question? Like how do I deal, if somebody's like highly suicidal, what does that mean? What if they're more low emotion? Like how would I best talk to them? And I would submit to you that's a little bit, it's a little bit easier to do if we're not jacked up, because and it doesn't mean that won't happen. We can sometimes have immediate reactions to things. The skill is pulling ourselves back or developing enough of a skill where maybe that's dampened. And so I think that's critical to your point. And actually, I think that's one of the best things about Force Science de-escalation class. We've incorporated like actual resilient skills into it, because how is it fair to officers to be like, go forth and don't escalate? Like, what does that mean, right? Like, go to de-escalation training. Well, what's the outcome? Well, don't escalate somebody. Get out of here, right? Like, that doesn't even make sense. But that's what people think. Just don't escalate somebody, right? But it would be most appropriate to give them some skills. Like they leave a class with some breathing technique, with some grounding skills, with a way to say like, hey, if I walk out the door, I have a skill that will work, that we've practiced, that we teach to each other, that we know, could work. And then like, basically I look at wellness like this, because everybody like kind of gives the, finger to wellness sometimes. But wellness is funny till it's culture, or it's stupid till it's culture. Right? And so these skills, like somebody's got to also be willing to step up and be like, hey, these are skills, like we're going to incorporate, like we're going to sit around them and teach them ground technique. We're going to breathe together. We're going to make this part, FTOs, incorporating them. They have influence on so many people. Having leadership be like, you know what? Like, I am doing a grounding skill when I get here in the morning. Like actually, like making it part of what we do.
Yes.
And I think that would lead to all sorts of things. That would more.
And Nicole, I would say that in our police academies, right, we don't ever talk about feelings, because we're really more concerned with performance. And anytime feelings come up, everyone shuts down the conversation. No one cares how you feel. Yet I think it's a disservice to our folks, because if you think about emotional intelligence, it all has to do with emotions, has to do with how you feel. Right? And if you don't know how you feel at all times, when I get up in the morning and I'm going on a day where I'm going to be in patrol, if my irritation level's a 5, if my frustration level's a 6, if my anger level's a 7, and I've got these issues at home, like I probably need to work through that somehow, some way. I better have some skills, because when I step foot in that patrol car and I carry this and someone pushes my button, right? It's going to be very difficult to de-escalate anyone when I'm escalated myself.
Right. And I wouldn't say it's 100% of the time, like, right? I've seen officers be kind of jacked up and do what I would submit to is still a pretty good de-escalation.
Sure.
But what would be better is if we give people the skill sets to be able to do that. Like, if you haven't been sleeping, maybe you and your partner have been fighting, or your kids are being little butt heads, right? Or maybe you're struggling like financially. Like always, financial struggles make all of life worse for people, right? And you're just coming feeling angsty into work. And what does everybody say? Well, leave your shit at home. Just do that, right? Okay, well, easier said than done. Or the reverse when you get home. Hey, just leave that stuff at work.
Leave it at
right?
work.
Because that's worked out so well for us. But normalizing talking about emotions and normalizing feelings would be great. People get kind of like this about it, but it's incumbent upon us individually to be like, hey, we need to talk about this. What about when you're scared? What about if you're uncomfortable? Everyone to imagine that doesn't happen to us. Like we are so, I like the word, I believe in stoicism to a degree, but I'm saying like we are so stoic that the emotions don't matter. Like that helps no one. Like they're there. And if they are, what are we going to do with them? And if they're, a little bit more, I'm just going to sign like negative to those. Like if I am angry or frustrated or sad or tired, right? Or even hungry, like that's going to affect interaction with people. But then it has to be intentional on our part to be like, okay, I know I'm feeling like this. I can't just, flip off it or I go on a call, like, because somebody like said something sideways to me. Honestly, we lose our jobs for emotional dysregulation stuff. So let's focus.
Well, that's the truth, right? Because most departments hire people for IQ, and
Not
then
EQ.
And then they fire for the lack of EQ.
Right.
And if you think about what the experts say there's kind of 3 parts to us, right? There's personality, which doesn't really change much, right? There's your IQ, which really isn't going to change much as well once you have your IQ that's what you are, right? But EQ is something that we can train. So it was good to hear that Force Science is actually putting that into some curriculum, because there's a lot of things that people can learn about self-awareness and how they carry themselves and how they're regulating themselves
Right.
and things like that. And I think it's a huge conversation when
And
it comes
knowing
to
your triggers,
de-escalation.
I talk about that. Like,
Yeah.
you know, because I'm not saying everybody, but I think we can agree there's a lot of type A personalities in law enforcement, right?
Oh, yeah.
And what type A personalities hate is being a puppet. Well, if you are not in control of your emotions, you are a puppet. And therefore, if somebody pushes your buttons, you're still a puppet. Type A likes to be the puppet master. Sometimes you just got to talk to people in the nature to see, like, hey, who are you? Are you the puppet master? Are you the puppet? Which one do you prefer? Well, what's everyone say? Hey, like, I want to be the puppet master. Then don't be reactive. It doesn't mean we don't have immediate visceral responses. That happens to human beings across the board. But the goal is, can you interject and put the brakes on before that becomes an issue? That's the goal. We have to have that. We have to have that skill. And if you talk to most officers, they do have that skill. They have something, right? But it still has to be trained. And the reason simply being because coping skills, resilience skills, all that stuff, it's for your worst day, not your best day, right? We all do kind of okay on a day everything's going all right, but it's that worst day, those worst calls, where somebody's just got under your skin, because we're human. I know everybody's like, nobody should get under your skin. Got it, like that sounds great, but sometimes somebody does. The skill for that, or the skill when you're really overwhelmed, or you really hear something so horrible and heinous.
You're seeing people on their worst day, but really what we're talking about now is if you're going to work on your worst day, and then you're seeing somebody on their worst day.
Yeah, where we at, people?
That's not going to work, and de-escalation really isn't going to be at your forefront.
Right. Yeah, especially if you're likely to be able to evaluate things if you're more in control of yourself. Again, it doesn't mean that that's an absolute 100% blanket. I've seen some great stuff in people who are still, I would say, a little, emotionally aroused, but we still need that skill, and it needs to be trained, and it needs to be part of the conversation. Normalizing emotional responses. Helping officers understand sometimes the people they're dealing with in crisis is one thing to talk about. Sometimes crisis is simply that person doesn't know how they feel. All of this is going on, they don't know what to do with it. Why do we imagine if we're like that, we may not struggle too? If we don't know what all this is, why am I angsty? Why am I struggling? Like, why am I this? Why am I that? If you can kind of work through that, you're likely to have a little bit more success. So yeah, I think that differentiates us from a lot of other areas, although I don't know if you've seen this. Resilience to me is like the newest 4-letter word in law enforcement. Why wouldn't we want resilience? Like, I don't know. I don't like that word. Well, okay, again, like call it something else. But we need those skills. We need to be able to ground ourselves. We need to be able to be in control. But we talk about trigger identification. I actually teach a little bit about unconscious trigger identification, recognizing that in other people. So I use an example. I'm just going to use you, Vic. Like, imagine Vic, he's a hard charger, like kicking ass, taking names, doing a really fantastic job. Just a great officer, like right out the door. But every time me and Vic go on this call where dad is drunk and dad has beat the living daylights out of mom and kids, Vic changes a little bit, and he seems a little bit more pokey, like he's trying to talk that dude into a fight, right? Like he's just like, something's different. That's not Vic. Like I never see that except on that type of call. How do I know Vic's background, right? Again, we don't have to be, like, I'm not the therapist to Vic when I'm a cop, right? But what if that's Vic's home life? I don't know that. What if that was his childhood, right? And it's subconscious. Like, we have unconscious triggers. So I use that as an example, but what if Vic doesn't even know he's doing it, right? Where's the conversation? Hey, Vic, did you know? Did you know you do this on this call? Sometimes to change behavior, I'll get to be like, hey, like, I don't know if you knew this. Hey, there's more work to do if it doesn't change after that. Sure, that's a whole other podcast, right?
Yeah.
But like helping people recognize unconscious triggers, changes in behavior.
Hey, you seemed a little more worked up this time.
Yeah, like,
what's going on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or is it just you're tired, lack of sleep? I mean, like, honestly, like I haven't eaten in 12 freaking hours.
Yeah.
Hey, let's go. Let's go.
Or
do
you
that.
might catch, this guy pisses me off. He did this to his kid.
Right.
Right.
Well, I hear you, but like eye on the prize, what do we need? I mean, I talk about like goal orientation for officers too. Like eye on the prize is great for emotional regulation, right? Because sometimes, how do I put it? We do the best job on our call, and I'm not banging on the prosecutors, but like the prosecutor declines or whatever, or your victim doesn't have any jury appeal or whatever it is. I tell officers, your eye on the prize is simply this: you're not the problem with your call. If somebody else messes up your call, let it be somebody else. But eye on the prize for us is we don't become the point of tension in the call. Oh, you got too pissed off, you did something. Like that one call, God, was it like 6 years ago in Missouri, where that guy threw the baby into the pond, like the frozen pond. Called 911 on himself. They go there, they arrest him, they hook him up. He's back at the station. and he was handcuffed, and the chief went in there and beat the daylights out of him, right?
Aren't chiefs allowed to do that? Wait.
There's no like, but I mean, think about that. Like, what would be best is a skill to interrupt. Not that I don't judge the chief for feeling like that. Like, it's not feelings that are wrong, it's actions from feelings, right? Was I allowed to have a feeling, like, in all honesty, was I allowed to go, like, man, I'm glad that guy got his ass kicked. He just almost killed his kid. Am I allowed to feel that for a second? Sure. Am I allowed to go, but now what? Right? Yeah. That's what the skills are for. It's the interruption for when the feelings, like the actions that are coming after those feelings do not benefit anybody, including yourself. That's what the brakes are for, man. Like, not that we're not allowed to feel like a certain way about something or see something, go like, oh my God. But why should we have to lose an entire job or then get arrested, like lose an entire career?
But here's that conversation, right? Feeling.
Right. Feelings.
Feeling. You feel that.
You're going to feel that way sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, what is your skill set for that? That, like, I always ask people, hey, what are you doing to get pissed off? Like, I can help, I can give people skills, but hey, tell me what your skill is. Like, what do you normally do? Hey, if you get really angry at work, what do you normally do with it? How do you handle it? What does that look like for you? It's also helpful if we know each other and be like, hey, because we as law enforcement, first responders, like military, like, we have to have those skills for immediacy, because sometimes we don't have the luxury of taking a step back. And sometimes we can, but sometimes we can't. So that skill has to be trained.
Sometimes you're the only one there for a bit.
Yeah. And so you got to dial yourself in. Again, eye on the prize. What do you need from this person? What's your goal in this moment?
Yep.
So we can do that. But yeah, I'm not saying we're not getting better, but you're right. Normalizing feelings. You talk about emotional intelligence. If you look at the job description, what do we want from law enforcement? That's usually, we want somebody who's emotionally intelligent. But then it's like, what does that mean to that department? How are they training it? What skills for emotional intelligence? Are they training under a certain model? That can be both honest accountability if we train them and not honest accountability if we don't. Because are we going to hold them to a metric of emotional intelligence that we've never trained, never given them the skills? They don't even know what their own baseline emotional intelligence is. Are we giving them skills if we don't like, where we're like, hey, we could probably grow that. Like, are we doing that? Or we just be like, don't do that again. Like, I didn't like that you did that. Are we giving them skills to be better and grow?
Well, I can see that's why this is really so frustrating for so many people, because we don't necessarily have a definition for de-escalation. So in a sense, I will be judged on what I do, but they can't tell me how to really do it. So there's no real criteria to tell me exactly 1 through 10 what to do.
Right.
Because I'm going to give it my best shot as a human being reacting in this situation. But they're always going to say, well, you shouldn't have done that.
Right. Well, that's the unfortunate thing, right?
Yeah.
Or you should have done something different. Again, it's that holding officers accountable for an imaginary outcome will never be okay. Because you know what? In the infinite possibilities of the world, I know I'm getting dramatic here, in a million different universes, maybe there are a million different outcomes. You got to deal with the one here. Here's the outcome. And can the officer help you understand why they did what they did? What did they perceive? What were the inferences they made? What information did they have? And why they did what they did? I mean, great. But we cannot operate from the fact that I wish he would have done something different. Like, here is your outcome.
Yeah.
Here it is. Whether you like it or not. It doesn't mean it wasn't justified. It doesn't mean it wasn't reasonable. Sometimes it doesn't mean there's not questions. Welcome to use of force a lot of times, right?
Right.
There's questions. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, can we get the answers? And sometimes we can. Sometimes, an officer may not remember, and that can be normal. That's also, a thing too. That can be normal. Like, the brain under stress is different than all of us sitting here.
Yeah.
But, holding them to a standard where, sometimes life is an educated guess.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me, years ago, we had an officer going before. It was either a disciplinary use of force board or a use of force board, and the chief chairing the board said, the officer, you shouldn't have done that. And the union rep said, well, chief, with all due respect, what should he have done? And the chief's response was, well, I don't know what he should have done. All I know is he shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, what kind of metric is that?
That actually was stated. And how does an officer, it's a non-existent standard you're expecting an officer to live up to, just because it's what feels good in a conference room.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure if somebody doesn't like the outcome, they wish the officer would have done something different. But at the end of the day, sometimes that might have been the only outcome no matter what that officer did. Like in the infinite possibilities of everything they could have done, maybe that could have been the only outcome that ever happened. The thing we don't know. But what I do know is we can't hold them accountable to the imaginary outcome we wished would have happened.
Right.
That will never be okay. And it goes so far against, that human performance standard of what people could or could not do in that time. And just because we have a badge or we're police officers, applying that, blanket to us is never okay.
Right.
Here's what happened. Is it justified? Is it reasonable? Was the threat assessment reasonable, especially when it's use of force? Like, what does that look like? What information did the officer have? Because, again, I mean, legitimately, like, we're in a world of educated guesses as cops based on what pattern recognition, right? Things you've dealt with before, a person you've dealt with before, something you've seen before. Like, your brain is full of those types of patterns. And you tend to, see what you see and then do what you do. Sometimes you can explain it, sometimes not, and that's where we're at. So we just need to kind of get on the same page that not remembering doesn't make an officer a liar. Right. I think we just need more education for everybody involved, right? Like attorneys, union reps, everything like that, like leadership on decision making and stress and what that looks like, on the realities of memory, best interview types, like what, all things considered, what would be a great thing we'd want our interviewers train in? How do we actually get information from people if it's a memory? How do we minimize, certain things in the brain that are likely to increase, like all those things. We're just, and I get like time, budgets, people, all that stuff, but officers deserve to be held to the standard and judged against one they could have met, not an invisible standard they couldn't meet.
Right.
So speaking of outcomes, because now we've heard all this increased push for de-escalation and de-escalation training, how often do we see negative outcomes due to officers waiting too long to act decisively? And what I mean by negative outcomes, whether it's serious injury or death to not only an officer, but possibly bystanders.
Yeah,
or
this
other
is what I would
people
submit to you.
involved.
I know that happens. How it's tracked and where it is, the truth is, I'm just being like, I have no idea. I don't know how I don't know who, like, it's actually, honestly, it's something we've been, not like forth, like we sit around, like all of us sit around and think up like epic research projects. I'm not joking, but to that point, hard to figure out because that's also perspective. So, we were talking about like, now man, I mean, this would be an undertaking, right? But asking that question, while deploying, so after receiving de-escalation training, whatever that looks like, and doing whatever, in the field, deploying de-escalation skills, obviously this would need to be refined, but work with me. Have you seen, or have you been hurt? Have you seen bystanders hurt? Where really the answer to the problem was probably quicker intervention. What does that look like? Like a force intervention or something like that.
Right.
Probably most officers are going to have, yeah, I saw that happen, right? And that's their perspective. But there's no database, there's no anything to track what we would consider those negative outcomes. But to your point, doesn't mean it's not happening. Like I said, everybody has a story where they've seen or experienced themselves. I was talking and I should have been doing, but I felt compelled to de-escalate, right? Like they're in that, like I shall do, like you must, like, you know what I mean? Like I'm stuck. Like almost everybody has that story where they've seen it, experienced it. So, or, you could go onto YouTube and watch a million videos and probably interpret that for yourself. It doesn't mean that's objectively true, not knowing anything about the video, but looking and going, wow, it looks like probably a force intervention here may have been, a different idea, right? And talking wasn't the issue. But when the force narrative is talking fixes problem, create space, create time, create distance, talk, like, why do we imagine nobody's going to get hurt in the process at all? The thing is, to my knowledge, there's nowhere that's tracked. It doesn't mean it's not, but I don't know of anywhere. But I would submit to you it's absolutely happening. And trying to figure out, but hey, maybe like you give me a research idea. Maybe the next time we chat, maybe I'll have figured out how to, kind of glean some of that information. But I mean, I would submit to you, all of you have that story too. You've seen it, you know it happens, you've watched it, whether it's at your department, a neighboring department, to one of your colleagues, to whatever,
Well,
and so you know it.
And I think where you see it surface too is in post-shooting investigations, post-use of force investigations, where they're doing interviews. And as union reps, when we were repping, we got to sit in on the IA side, internal affairs side of the investigation, not the criminal. But and it was not uncommon sometimes to hear an officer. It's like they're reflecting inside their head and going, yeah, I probably waited too long to do X, Y, Z. Or, because now they're calmed down, they're kind of coming back to baseline, and they're able to kind of logically think through and replay what happened. And, you know, and they'll just conversationally with the investigators go, maybe I should have done something sooner.
Well, I teach a lot, and when I do one, not typically so we have a 2-day instructor class, and then like a 1-day, consider it like, it's a good education, but like line officer class. And I always ask the class, never expect him to answer out loud. I say, tell me on break, whatever. I ask, hey, I just want to know if you're voluntold to come to this training. Like, is this part of your like mandatory hours? Like, what does that look like? Are you here for punishment? I never expect anybody to say any of that stuff in front of the class, right? But on break, they're like, I'm here for punishment. What is typical? What is very typical is somebody was doing some like QA, a body cam. They heard a phrase they didn't like. And I'm just being honest, it's not taken, any contextual relevance is not taken. They just don't like the phrase, so magically you go to de-escalation training, therefore now this will never happen, all right? We all know that's not meetable, but that's pretty common, right? But I was teaching a class, and this one officer shared an experience with me. You guys, it's mind-blowing. And he said, let me tell you something that happened to me. He went to a de-escalation training, and it was like a blended audience, like say civilians, law enforcement, church security, like hospital, like whatever, you know. They videoed, they did some scenario-based training, they video the scenarios and everything like that. And they set up, I think what maybe all of us here would agree was not a meetable scenario for anybody to be successful. I call it a de-escalation hood drill. So what they did, and this is the officer sharing this with me, what they did is they basically put a hood on your head. They put, like, say I'm as close to this person as you have a gun to your head. They pull the hood off my head. What am I supposed to do? Okay, well, realistically, no officer is ever going to be in, like, well, I would say choose to be in the position of a foot from somebody with a gun to their head. Now, we can talk all day about the science of how fast that gun can turn and what the likelihood is. And this officer, in that moment, made a determination that this was not a de-escalatable event. Like, that person was probably going to shoot them. Like, you know, they're going to turn that gun. I'm going to be dead. This is not the time for verbal interaction. That was his choice. And so he made a force intervention, right?
Yeah.
They video this.
Good move.
Okay. That company sent a letter to his department with a recommendation of termination to say, if you keep this officer on, he will be killing the mentally ill in your community. Okay.
Wow.
That's not the worst part. That's not the worst part.
Oh, it gets better?
No, it gets better. So his department was like, don't you worry. Like they were like, no, this is not a realistic event. I mean, I guess somebody could pop out of it like a hallway, but let's be real here, people. I mean, that's not realistic, right? Realistic scenario-based training, that's what we should have. But fast forward a couple weeks, he gets dispatched to a suicide by cop call. Okay? So, and this is he told me this. He goes, Nicole, he goes, he has a partner. He's like, I'm dealing with this elderly gentleman. He is suicidal. He's sitting in the recliner with a shotgun. And he's raising the shotgun. And in my head, it wasn't shoot him, nothing like that. It was, if I shoot him, am I going to be what they said? Don't tell me the stuff that we do doesn't impact people. You know, no training's better than bad training. He's lucky to be here. And good for him that he morphed past that. But the stuff we do, the stuff we train, like, it impacts people's decision making. Like, can you imagine, like, being in the face of somebody raising a shotgun to force you to kill them so you are the tool for their suicide, right? And being like, I don't want to be what that letter said. And a lot of people would be like, oh, like, bullshit, you know what I mean? Or, oh, like, that's not what should have been in his brain. Yeah, I hear you. I don't like it was in his brain either, but it was.
Right.
Like,
That planted the seed.
Right, that was very
that
powerful.
letter.
Because imagine getting that letter thinking, oh, am I going to get fired? Is my department going to fire me because they think that? And no, they were realistic. You know, they know that, like, that was not the best scenario, all things considered, right? But the things we do, like, especially as instructors and stuff, you know, they have power. We influence a lot of people. We got to be setting up people for confidence and competence in what they do. And some training out there is not that, right? Thankfully, that officer's still here. And I really appreciated him sharing that with me, you know, simply because, you know, that is the potential impact what we do can have on people, right? And so our goal should be never to have something like that, but to always give people, like, the skills, whether it's emotional regulation skills, you know, grounding, breathing, the actual skills for communication, evaluation of behavior, what's most likely to work at this time frame, you know, like, how best can I connect with this person, all things considered. We should be building, you know, the skill sets of confidence and competence for our officers to go and deploy that, and then we judge them again on a metric they can meet, like, all those things considered, not against imaginary outcomes.
Yeah. Would you, as we wrap up here, could you talk a little bit about the TEB model?
Yes. So the TEB model is developed by Dr. John Azar Dickens. He's a forensic psychologist out of Georgia.
And what's it stand for?
thought, emotion, behavior.
Okay.
So it's the TEB model of crisis intervention. Actually, Dr. John wrote a book. You guys can pick it up on Amazon. I don't get any kickbacks from it. I think you should get it. But we incorporated the TEB model of crisis intervention into our de-escalation program quite a few years ago. And for those of you guys obviously have trained at Force Science and taken some of our classes, it is very typical for somebody to get to Force Science due to use of force, right? I'm in internal affairs, I don't know use of force, I want to learn about human factors, I want to do expert witness, whatever that is.
Right.
And I'm very lucky to have that background. But let me tell you, I went to a Force Science de-escalation class, and I was a SWAT negotiator for like 17 years. And I saw that TEB model, and I said, I'm not joking, where has this been all my life? I loved it. And here's why. When you are what's considered the best communicator, and I'm not getting on a pedestal, like I just tend to connect with people really well. When you're the best communicator and you're on duty, right? Everybody wants you there because you're the best communicator. But my question is simply, why are we all not best communicators? And I saw the TEB model, and I said, this is a great way to build all of us on a more even playing field. So the design of the TEB model is it evaluates thought between clear thought and contaminated thought. Clear, logical, rational, analytical, contaminated of some sort, sliding scale. It could be alcohol, it could be drugs, it could be a mental health emergency, medical emergency. What they ingested could be dehydration, like we don't know, right? But they are not in the logical, rational, analytical world. Now, how I relate it, because it's a sliding scale, if we used alcohol in as an example, think of 2 beers in to commode hugging drunk. Do we not have a lot of room there, right? But it's for
Right.
many different reasons, okay? Sometimes that reason, emotion alone, nothing on board. Anger, hurt, pain, rage, pissed, right? Like some people when they ramp up, man, nothing's there. Like that prefrontal cortex is gone, right? So contaminated. It looks at emotion, high emotional states or low. So think low, cool, cold, flat. High, like are we yelling, screaming, intensity, volume, stuff like that. Has to be evaluated very objectively, not based on personal experience, right? And then behavior, we're pretty good at this one typically, compliant or non. And what it does is it takes the clusters, I'm going to just use, for example, contaminated, thought, high emotion, non-compliant. It takes that and said, hey, all things considered, if you see this cluster, what's the best communication that would work, that's most likely to work? Well, it's crisis communication, right? Some type of emotionally based communication. That person tends to be like super intense. But it also gives you additional information. What's the risk associated with this? It looks at something called aggression states. Like, is it a primal aggressor, right? We all recognize primal aggression, that intensity, anger, high intense emotions, rigid muscles, gritted teeth, carotid pulse like a zillion miles an hour, right? Or is it a cognitive aggressor? Somebody who's purposeful in their violence. I think of like a cop killer profile, like cool, cold, calculating violence. Doesn't mean they're all cop killers by any means. Could it be a sovereign citizen? Just somebody purposeful, just purposely violent individual,
Right,
somebody
right.
goal-oriented different than you, right? And it just gives you information. It says confusion, for example, confusion may be likely due to mental illness, like suicide by cop shows up here. It just gives you all sorts of stuff and recommends a communication type. And the communication types involved in the matrix are crisis communication. Then there's something called task-focused communication. Think of that as your everyday back and forth, very clear, brief, exchange of information. And then directive communication, which we more typically know in law enforcement is the ask, tell, make, or the ask, tell, confirm, non-compliance, but limit-setting communication, right? So I'm just telling you, like you can make an estimation of behavior very quickly with the TEB model. Now, nobody's gonna like whip it out, in the middle of like sit tight for a second, right? The goal is to build the recognition of the behavior profiles with immediacy. So what we do in class is a lot of video analysis of behavior, right? Not context of the video, what happened. Like, look at this behavior, tell me what you see, what profile. We discuss it, because not everybody's gonna agree. Everybody comes to the table with their own lens. We discuss it, we talk about what that looks like, what is contaminated, what do we see. Give me examples of what contamination is. Like, okay, if you think it's high emotion, give me examples. Help me understand why you think it's low emotion. All things considered, if you think it's low, would crisis communication work? No, well, do you see a high intensity? Oh yeah, I do see a high intensity. Like, so we discuss it. We look at, and compliance is looked at under the lens, not for an arrest, but if I'm like, hey buddy, what's your name? And they're like, F off. Like that tells me something, right? Like that's not compliance, not to arrest somebody. So you make evaluations based on these clusters, and then it basically guides you to the best type of communication. So I was like, well, if I had to choose a weakness, and the truth is I don't think there's many, but if I had to choose one, what is very typical in law enforcement? Logic-based communication. It's a default. Like we're logical, linear creatures in this job. We're problem solvers, right? So in the face of high intense emotion, if somebody is by default a logic-based communicator, they sometimes don't know logic and emotion don't mix, as simplistic as it sounds. Some people don't know that. And then that person is probably going to escalate, right? The interjection of logic into emotion is an escalation factor. Doesn't mean it's intentional by the officer. People only know what they know. But what if they go, hey, you know what, I'm a logic-based communicator. Holy cow, you know what I learned from Nicole? Logic and emotion don't mix. I'm going to now default when I see that under this profile to emotionally based communication. I'm going to engage in crisis communication. That's what this person needs. Maybe we can problem solve later, right? But it talks about, hey, you can't problem solve with somebody in the immediate state of crisis. They got to be prepared to hear you. They got to be prepared to come down a little bit. So it ties that up. And the truth is, I love that model. I think it's very successful. It's also very successful in helping like command staff, for example. Hey, why didn't you de-escalate? Like, why didn't you engage in like what I call their traditional de-escalation active listening? If they're like, hey, there's a profile, a specific profile, a clear-minded, low emotion, non-compliant person, a instrumental like cognitive aggression, right? A purposely violent, many times criminal-minded, antisocial, stuff like that. Well, they don't respond to active listening. How can they, right? They could be actually hardwired different, a different emotional base, lack of empathy, no worry, no guilt, whatever that is. Like, you can't connect with that through an emotional level. You have to communicate with them, what? Limit setting, right? So it tells you that. So again, it holds people, again, to the same mutable standard. I didn't engage in crisis communication because I saw this profile, which is absolutely not crisis communication. It's directive communication. This person's very risky, right? And so I chose to engage in that. So it kind of puts everybody in the same playing field. It helps us do a risk assessment. What categories are riskier? And so I fell in love with that thing, and Dr. John published his book pretty recently on it, and I just loved it. And I can tell you the feedback that, me personally, that I have gotten from students attending the class is just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And some agencies that have taken, individuals taking the class, they've actually added the TEB to their drop-down menu for use of force. So they capture the TEB model in the use of force. And, in a year or so, they can go back and say, hey, what profiles have higher force? And it's different. Some agencies have said and this would make sense to you guys, like they have higher instances of use of force with contaminated, high, non-compliant. Why? Because holy cow, that's everything to do with some challenges, right? I've talked to some agencies that are like, Nicole, no, our use of force is clear, low, non-compliance. That's where it mostly is. Like for them, it's just, there's no right or wrong answer. There's just what are they seeing individually? It informs report writing, right? Like you capture the profile, you document what that looks like. Hey, what was contaminated? What'd that look like, right? Not like see video, like some bad DUI officers, like, what FST, see my video. No, like give me an example of contamination. What did you see that was high emotion?
Right.
Or was it purposeful? What did they tell you? Give me your name. Officer, you can go F and kill yourself, right? Like, what is that? Got it. Like, hey, this is a documented noncompliance, not for an arrest, but for what? How do I talk to this person if possible? So I just love that. And so I'm happy to run across the country and teach everybody that.
Sounds like an incredible model. And for once, really, it allows people to kind of name exactly what they're seeing, right?
Yep.
Because a lot of times you come into any kind of a situation and you immediately tell yourself, all right, they're at this level, right? They're already escalated, they're at a 3, they're at a 5, they're at a... So it kind of helps you put some names to some of it, right?
Yep, and like I said, if we can bridge that gap, again, I don't think there's a lot of weakness in law. I operate that we are very successful at this de-escalation and persuasion and communication right from the get-go. Doesn't mean we can't increase our skill set. So what does it do? If I recognize, hey, crisis communication more likely than not right now. Oh no, task focused, okay, I'm here. Oh, crisis communication to reduce, then problem solve? Okay, got it. No, they need directive. This is a very challenge, like they need direct limit setting from the get-go. It just eliminates some of that time component. Because we've all seen, again, let's take assigned intention out of it. We've seen an officer have an interaction and that person continues to escalate, right? Well, if you problem solve too early, that can happen. You introduce logic to emotion, or that person's just not ready to problem solve. They can't process yet, right? Because if they could problem solve, we probably wouldn't have got called.
Right.
So it just gives them a guide like, hey, they're not ready for that. I need to see something change, whether it's body language, verbal intonation, like what does that look like? And so again, and also from if we want to talk about like an accountability perspective, like we're on the same playing field to say, and plenty of agencies that I've taught, they've adopted that, right? And so when they even review use of force, so we already know there are some challenges with somebody who's contaminated, high non-compliant. We know that exists. We know there's challenges, clear, low non-compliance, like somebody who's purposely violent or purposely engage in a certain type of conduct. So it just kind of gives us all an ability to have the same conversation. And like I said, John published his book, and I think it's fantastic. And it does have some information if people are interested in diagnoses, because again, in force science, we talk about some diagnoses, but we focus on behavior. But what he does talk about is certain diagnoses may fall in these categories, and just like information, for people. And I just really love it. And I think it's honestly one of the biggest things for our class, like the fact that we're giving somebody practical, tangible tools. Like when they learn that, they can walk out the door and deploy that. They know these profiles when they leave that class. A general working automatic. Like they see it, I know it. They see it, I know it. Because it's just play a video, know it. And it's easy for the instructors to do when they get back to their agency. And then, of course, the incorporation of the resilient skills. So, hey, how can I evaluate that? No, it's crisis communication, because now I have some skills for myself. Or if my partner's going a little, hey, breathe, let's go. Like you and me breathe, let's do some, we do like cyclic sigh. We teach my colleague, Dr. Robbie Adler-Tapia, she's got a great book, One Badge, One Brain, One Life. I've adopted some of her skills, like kind of like a bilateral box breathing with some keywords like aroma, grounding skills. And then so they got practical skills to use on the street, practical skills for themselves that they can, ideally dial themselves back. And so I would honestly just run across the country with the TUB model. I really like it. And it's very effective and it's very fast. That's what we need. We can't be like, these 30-point decision-making models. No, like, hey, contaminated, high, non-compliant, that's crisis. Clear, low, non-compliant, hey, that's, directive. Like, I see this, problem solve. Like, when can I do
When
this?
you have that high EQ, you get on scene very quickly.
Boom.
And you go, okay, I see what his motivation is. I see exactly what he's trying to do.
And we talk purpose and behavior, like what motivates a person, how bizarre is their behavior? Because sometimes when a person is not connected sometimes to this reality, right? Like they're very bizarre, their motivation is not the same as it would be if they were logical, rational, analytical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like the cool thing about that is it's very simple and user-friendly.
Yes.
And once you do it a few times, I think it becomes an automatic pre-programmed response.
Right,
to your
because again, it just becomes a pattern.
It's an assessment model that you can go through like that.
And I think if you're writing it down in the reports and actually documenting it, then it completes that training, so it becomes very solid in your vocabulary.
Right.
Yeah,
right?
and so I just love that, and I love that some people are capturing it for use of force. I think that's really interesting. There's actually research that ties it to CIT. There's some research out of San Francisco that talks about people who are trained in the 40-hour CIT and then our 8-hour de-escalation with the application of the TUB model, what that looks like. And so they've captured data for a couple of years.
Wow.
Because they've obviously have I work in a small town, much higher instances and numbers of crisis communication. So some good solid numbers to look at. They've captured, for example, what profiles, tend to be more challenging. Flexi had done a little bit of research. They've got some, they were looking at some draft lesson plans and stuff about like the application of the TUB model, like, high emotional states and resistance and, contamination and what that looks like and, stuff like that. So it also just puts us as like an informed discussion. So I think that is probably, to me, like, obviously I work for force science and obviously I instruct in de-escalation. But the truth is, I think our program is better than any de-escalation program in the nation. And we give officers, some tangible things of what they need. One, for their skills to deploy, and then two, for themselves to ideally, have self-regulation. We talk, a little bit about emotional intelligence. We talk about, triggers, personal vulnerabilities, inadvertently not marginalized. People understand, like, people are just at where they're at. How do we meet them where they're at? How to be more comfortable, even though, again, this 16-hour class or an 8-hour, can we be more comfortable with some of the language? Don't be afraid of, do you want to kill yourself? Like, what's your plan? How can we look at things differently and evaluate it for letting people dump energy again? And it can change even in the middle of it. Can we let people pace? Can we let them scream? Can we let them flail? What does that look like? Depending on, our view of unarmed or armed, doing risk assessments with it, trying to take our safety into consideration when building relationships, looking at de-escalation, nuance for communication, like persuasion, strategic messaging, like what does that look like, tied to our goal, even though it may change. And so there's just some stuff I think that really benefits officers and ties it to human performance, because when everybody imagines you should be 6 feet away from somebody, what does that really mean? like how fast can people, so how fast can they cover ground? What does that look like? To make informed decisions about communication, and be able to talk to the public about like, hey, if our officers aren't 3 feet from somebody and up in a personal space, like, hey, let's talk about why that is. Like, not just from the risk assessment for assaults, but hey, if somebody's in crisis, why do we imagine I want to be all up in them? Like,
Right.
why do we imagine I want to?
I think
should I
that's
be
the best
closer?
training you can absolutely do in the world. When you go to a class where you learn about yourself, right?
Right.
And you can learn about other people and how your job, how you can use yourself within, you're a part of that, right?
Yep.
You're a part of the de-escalation process. You're part of that relationship. You're the other half.
Yep.
So you have to enter in with that mindset and knowing about yourself, knowing about other people. So when you
Critical.
have training that really relates to all of that, right? Regulating yourself and then helping other people.
Yep. Understanding the realities of what that looks like. How much time
Right.
do we have? What does that look like for force intervention? And again, on a best day, can we create space, create time, create distance, like to develop that relationship? Sometimes we can, but what does it look like if we can't? And just evaluate it like together and have those conversations again to educate. Because again, I think educating the public is important and critical in this, but sometimes we have to educate our own people on the realities of what this is and have them look at it from a different lens to understand, the human performance aspects of communication too, because that doesn't disappear from our job. Because in law enforcement, we talk more than we're ever going to do anything else. We talk more than we fight. We talk more than we shoot. We talk all the time, right? So on that note, what does that look like for us? Build those skills. All sorts of different communication skills. I really think as officers, it's different. We should go to different interviewing skills, forensic interviewing, child interviewing, cognitive interviewing, trauma-informed interviewing. We should actually go to contract negotiations, civilian contract negotiations, sales, customer service. This isn't the super secret police communication. People are people. And let's learn all the persuasion styles. We should take a hell of a lot more crisis intervention type stuff, learn how to talk to people who have been sexually assaulted, learn the nuances of that. How do I talk to a child versus an adult? We're dealing with people in all sorts of mind frames. So, give them the tools to do the job, not assume they have them,
Yeah. So, man, that's excellent. One of the last things I want to touch on is a real world case that happened in February 27th of this year. There's an incident that unfolded in Hartford, Connecticut. Officer Joe Magnano had about 1 year and 4 months on the job and responded to a call involving a mentally ill black man. He was brandishing a knife. He was an uncontained suspect, key point, refusing to follow commands, numerous officers on scene. And of course, we all know how it wrapped up. He was ultimately shot and killed by Officer Magnano. And it was kind of a shot heard around the world because it very volatile, lots of video out there. It's on YouTube. Created a lot of controversy, but it deals with, I think this is a microcosm of bringing together a lot of the stuff we've talked about in the last hour and a half, because we talked about the concept of infinite outcomes. Poorly written administrative policies, didn't exhaust all available options, which is an opinion. It's an opinion. It deals with the elements of human performance, unreasonable expectations, and everybody out there has an opinion. Now, they obviously, a lot of people, experienced law enforcement officers, I think, watch the videos and go, he did fine. And a lot of people in the communities that watch it go, oh my God, why did he do that? You've got this vast chasm of beliefs on how that was handled.
Right.
So your boss, Von Kleem at Force Science, wrote what I thought was just an outstanding, excellent 3-part series, did a detailed breakdown of this case, talking about the everything from the legalistic issues, interpretations of case laws, human performance, human factors, the issue of unreasonable expectations that are put on police officers. And so I mention that because when this video goes up, I'm going to link all 3 of those articles
Awesome.
from Vaughn, because I think they're very important to give really good, clear, concise context and perspective on divorcing the emotion out of it, but just looking at the facts of the case, applying law, relevant case law, and then bringing in the human performance elements that
Right.
I think force science is so incredibly good at.
Agreed.
So,
Yeah, I'm
but-
really glad. Thank you for actually having that opportunity to link those articles. Yeah, it's that Never Enough. It's like that part 3 series.
Yes.
And it really deep dives into it, you know, and especially you hit on that infinite, like holding officers accountable to imaginary infinite outcomes and criminalizing that.
Well,
you
and
know,
then- yeah.
is just honestly so unreasonable.
Well, and in simple terms for our audience, what we're talking about with infinite outcomes is if you tell in the investigation, say, I backed up 8 steps, then they can always go, why didn't you back up 9?
Yeah, why not 9? Why not 10?
Why not 10?
You
Yeah.
know,
So when is enough enough? And I think Bond does a really great job of addressing all those points. But as we close here, and I promise you, you get the last say. Anything else we haven't covered that needs to be mentioned with regards to what we discussed?
No, just thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm glad that I think one of our weak areas in law enforcement is trying to do our best to educate the public. You know, we all know what we know, and sometimes we are judged from a standard only because somebody doesn't know. And when we're out there giving them information, the ability to do some reflection, right? What changes people's minds? Conversation, education, information, not from an emotionally driven standpoint, but being able to say, hey, have you considered? Or, hey, did you know?
Right.
So I really love that. And I'm glad you're linking Vaughn's articles just simply for the fact, again, it's just a very layered, nuanced look, again, at de-escalation, because that's the crux of it, right?
Right.
When the standard is you shoulda, woulda, coulda done it. You know, I mean, think of that as just a standard, right? Exhaust, like, what does that mean? And when does it stop? You know,
Right.
like honestly, a call could go on for, like, honestly, I mean, I sound dramatic, but like for all eternity, like what does exhaust every resource? What is every resource? What does that mean? And, you know, it kind of removes the fact that it's not taking into account like the officer's perspective in that moment, right?
Right.
Like, because like force options are driven by what? The inferences they make, their perspective, like in that moment that they use force. Like obviously we talk about totality of circumstances, but you know, they're making educated guesses like in that moment with whatever information they have, many times incomplete. What does that look like? And you know, if we judge somebody on imaginary outcomes to infinite, you know, like I just in my head when I read about that, I just think of these layers of infinitesimal outcomes, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
like what is happening? Oh, hey, in this world, like did 9 steps work? But that's not realistic. Like what does that
Right.
look like?
Right.
And we need to judge them on the reasonableness. One, obviously, there's the law side of things, right? What was the use of force reasonable, like justified? Was the threat assessment reasonable? Like what was going on? And, you know, Vaughn addresses that in the articles. And I would encourage anybody watching, you know, to actually go to our website and actually sign up for the newsletter, to be honest. Like it's free.
Yeah.
And we're not going to, just so you know, everybody, we're not selling your information to anybody, right? You know, but it's a library of so much information of people at Force Science and of outside experts, right?
Right.
Vaughn has some other articles on there actually about de-escalation, you know, like the 5 C's of de-escalation talks about like, you know, like the conditions for de-escalation, what that looks like. And he breaks all that down, you know, and talks about like what is actually containment, like what does a contact look like? What is cooperation? You know, talk about like, you know, what are we talking about with strategic, but it's not just de-escalation, right? There's stuff about use of force, there's stuff about communication, de-escalation, body cam. Like think of a topic and
Right.
it is at your fingertips.
Right.
And so I would encourage people, of course, I would love for people to come to my de-escalation class. I'm, you know, one of the primary de-escalation instructors. And so I would hope people would come and just, you know, because the TEB model applies to, it's not law enforcement, it applies to people, right? Church security, hospital security, like whatever that looks like, field security. We deal with people, right?
Right.
I would encourage people to buy Dr. John's book.
Yeah, and we can link that
Yeah,
under
absolutely.
the video as well. We'll probably do that.
Just because I think it's really important. But I would just tell people out there, I hope just from listening to like all of you guys, the amazing panel, thank you for the opportunity, but that it creates conversation. It creates, you know, some thinking, just looking at things from a different perspective, because that's where change starts.
Right.
You know, is just to be able to have some available information that's different than what you knew, because that's all of us. That's everybody sitting here.
Right.
No, like me sitting in this chair, being able to talk to all of you and this amazing opportunity. I didn't start here, I grew here, right? And so what we're giving people is opportunity to reflect and grow and have some different information. So that to me is appreciative, and I'm always happy to talk about what I call the realities of de-escalation. So we're held to a mutable standard and evaluated under a standard that is tied to human performance and that honest accountability. So I just want to thank you guys for that. Thanks for letting me talk
Absolutely.
about Dr. John's work and the TED
Yeah.
model. Like, I think it's cool. I don't know how long your podcasts typically go, but like I definitely can drag one out for hours. So
It goes just long enough. And
yeah,
not
just
a minute
long,
longer.
yeah, just long enough. But but thank you for that, and
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to come back anytime. I just
Sure.
want officers to be out there kicking butt, taking names, like under honest accountability, taking care of the public and taking care of themselves simultaneously, because that we deserve to thrive in this job and thrive when we retire and have happy, healthy, successful lives, families,
Absolutely.
and relationships. And that does not come by existing. That comes with work. I just want people to have that.
Yeah, absolutely, agreed. And one more quick question. So for our people that view this, if an average citizen wants to take a force science course, can they do that? Is it limited only to law
No,
enforcement?
civilians can take courses. In fact, I think I advocate for education purposes, like civilians should take it, security, like what that looks like. I can, because I do the de-escalation prep, if like somebody comments like, Nicole, I'd really like a civilian only, like what does that look like? Hey, I can make that happen, like stuff like
Sure.
that. The same for like the wellness stuff. So, they can do that. They can take classes. We have an online class too. Me personally, like I think online's important, especially with training budgets, but who doesn't my favorite part of teaching is what? I'm not
In-person
the only
interaction.
expert in the room. I could have a class of 100 people and there's 100 experts, right?
Right.
And to just have conversations and learn from each other. Hey, what worked for you? What does that look like? And we're all learning from each other in the process of learning some other stuff in the class. But yeah, so it is not. In fact, I always encourage therapists, psychologists, clinicians, because I can tell you what, if you treat law enforcement and you do not understand the biomechanics and human factors of force encounters, you will inadvertently marginalize your people. You will harm officers unintentionally in the counseling process, in your clinical work, if you don't understand force encounters. If you don't know, hey, how do officers shoot? How fast do assaults go? Why do rounds go in the back? What does that look like? How fast do people cover distance? How fast can somebody pull a gun? How fast can somebody stop shooting? What does that look like? If those are not understood by clinical staff, even people with the best of intention to want to help officers, they may inadvertently harm people if they don't understand the biomechanics of the use of force.
Right.
And especially like coming to the 5-day class, like Dr. Robbie has been to the 5-day, it's just sometimes in therapy when you're talking to people, you talk about not the therapy, but a human factors component, and that blows their mind. Well, hey, did you know about like how long it takes somebody to like stop shooting, like in reality, like what that looks like? Do you know how fast the human body can turn? Do you know about decision making under stress? Because you will sometimes, I was at a intensive like retreat and we were talking about some of the force applications, biomechanics of force, not where we're starting to do the intensive work. And I will never forget this guy he was just sitting there. And I could tell he was really
Wrestling
like,
with
yeah,
something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so on the break, I was like, hey man, you good? Like, what's up? And he's like, I've been struggling with my shooting for 15 years. And he goes, I have never heard what any of you have said. Like, I've never heard about the mechanics of the use of force. Like what happened is typical, all things considered. Because he shared with me. I'm like, yes. And you watch just like, honestly, it seemed in a moment like 15 years of angst and almost like, I don't want to say self-hatred because I'm not here to assign that, but like not like just all that angst and not knowing what was up.
Tension,
Because
yeah.
like what the human brain doesn't like, they don't like not knowing why. Like it's very, like we
may
want
be
to
dealing
know.
with some moral injury.
Yeah,
right?
100%, 100%. And so now like they know, and I've seen that even, and I'm not talking like wellness class, I'm talking in force encounters investigation, and on one-day force. We're just talking about biomechanics, like people that have been involved in critical incidents, and they get a piece of a puzzle they just didn't know from a science-informed perspective, like human factors and human factor psychology. You watch it blow their mind. And sometimes it's a piece they needed
Yeah.
to make peace inside themselves, right?
Yeah.
They just
Right.
didn't, they just didn't know. And so I always encourage clinical staff to, at minimum, if they attend like a 2-day force encounter, so they get a little bit intro, but the 5 days really fantastic because it gives people the background to understand the realities of police force encounters so we don't inadvertently create harm in the clinical environment. Because if somebody they just know what they know. Hey, I don't know why there's so many rounds in the back. Like, why is that? What do you mean you can't stop shooting immediately? Like, of course you can stop doing that immediately. If they just subconsciously think those things, they just might harm their client. We don't want that. So
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because when I actually talked to officers when I was working and guys that had gone to counseling, and I actually heard this a couple of times, and they go, how'd that work out? It's like, dude, it sucked, man. I spent my counseling session educating the psychiatrist or the psychologist on police work. They don't know, they don't understand anything.
Or not everybody's cut out to be a trauma therapist. Like people gravitate to want to do that, right?
Right.
Not everybody is that. So we all hear horror stories of officers going, oh my God, like they said, like the clinician told me, stop talking, I can't handle what you're saying. Why would they ever go back to therapy? Like why would they ever want to seek therapy again? When they finally are ready, they're like, oh my God, maybe I do need some help. And then they go do that, and then they get that. Or somebody like, we're human, but like, don't think crying with your cops is like building. Just like crying with victims is not helpful. Like you can't be crying along, like sobbing with them. Like you have to have a professional boundary to be able to help somebody. So one, that's a whole separate. Like we need to vet clinicians. We need to send officers to the right type of people. We can't imagine sending them to EAP. And I'm not slamming on marriage and family therapists, but that is not a trauma therapist. That's not somebody who understands first responders, military, police, understands like the layers that goes into that. Gallows humor, like it's not a pathology, people. Like that's how we deal with stuff. I get if somebody hears it, they feel all sorts of ways about it, but it's a normal coping mechanism, all things considered.
Right.
But then to like pathologize that or, I always, again, like we can go on forever. I'm just going to end with this. Mm-hmm. I think we've made a lot of strides in I don't care where you go, resilience, wellness, brain flexibility, like whatever that is. But until the day every officer can be in a room with their chief and raise their hand and say, I felt like blowing my brains out, and they're not stripped of their gun, we haven't made headway. That's like, we need to be comfortable to talk about those things and normalize. Not everybody feels it, but for those who did, like, it needs to be like, hey, like that happens. And we should be able to say it in front of leadership, and we should be able to talk about it, and everybody doesn't feel all sorts of ways, from even a civilian standpoint. I don't take everybody's gun who's a civilian when they're suicidal.
Right.
Like there's a lot of work in stabilizing people and what that looks like. But officers are afraid if they admit to how they're feeling, they're not fit.
Right.
Or they're disordered. Like you're not disordered by nature of experience some stuff that's pretty shitty. Like you're not a disorder, right? Mm-hmm. So I just think we need to have bigger conversations. We can do that on different podcasts because God, I could go on for hours about that.
Yeah.
But like, take care of yourselves, take care of your people, and thank you guys for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks again for making the trip, carving out the time. It's it's awesome to have somebody sit in the day and age of tech we live in, everybody does the link in with Zoom on a Zoom call because it's super convenient. But it's like you said, face to face is awesome.
Yeah, it's fun.
And for all of you that are watching, thanks for watching the show. And if hit the like, subscribe, and share button certainly. And if there's something that might be a benefit from this, then certainly pass the link.